One early morning in April of 2012, a man was walking through the woods in coastal France. He lived nearby and he had just seen a column of smoke coming out of the trees in this area, and so he was just coming out here to make sure there was not a brush fire or something. And so he walked through the woods and eventually he reached the source of the smoke. It was in this clearing, and right away he felt relieved because what he saw was just the remains of a bonfire. And it was just smoldering, and now there was just some smoke coming up off of it. He was about to turn around and go maybe get some water and douse it out completely, but he smelled something. Like it was a weird smell that clearly was coming from the fire. And so curious, there's nobody else around, he just began walking to the fire to see what was making this smell. And as he got close enough, he realized there was something in that fire. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice fresh burrito. But don't tell them, instead of using ground beef, you used cat food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of April 26, 2012, a 39-year-old bouncer named Lionel Veronese opened the door of a nightclub in Chambéry, France, and he let a woman inside. And as this woman came in, she stopped and made a point to look at Lionel and smile at him and thank him by name. So Chambéry was a small city up in the Alps, and Lionel, the bouncer, was a fixture in its nightlife scene. Pretty much everybody in town who went out to the bars and clubs had either seen Lionel standing at the door outside or partying inside when he was not on the clock. And it was not just the locals who knew who this guy was. Lionel was also well known among the rich and famous tourists who often vacationed in Chambéry, and even sometimes he would pick up side work as a bodyguard for these rich and famous people. And for Lionel, his career as sort of this fixture in the nightlife scene was fun and pretty glamorous at times. But it also could be dangerous. In fact, just a few months ago, he got into this huge fist fight protecting one of his clients, and in fact, he actually got arrested for it. But tonight, Lionel was just trying to get through a shift without any trouble. There was this long line of people who were waiting outside the club, waiting to get in, and Lionel checked their IDs one by one and let them in. And then finally, when the line started to clear, Lionel saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was his good friend, Mike Boof, who Lionel often went drinking with multiple times a week. And at first, Lionel was just really glad to see Mike. But as Mike got closer, Lionel realized that Mike actually looked really mad. And so by the time Mike actually reached Lionel just said to him, hey, what's going on? You look pretty upset. And Mike would tell him that he had just been at his friend Philippe's house, and Philippe had told him that seemed really, really weird. So Philippe Perrier, Mike's friend, the guy whose house he just came from, was extremely wealthy because his family ran this world-famous winery near Chambéry. Now, Lionel had never actually met Philippe himself, but he knew of him. His family was incredibly well-connected in town because they're so rich and they had this winery. And Mike was friends with him and often talked about him. And so now Mike explained to Lionel what this really weird thing was that he heard when he was visiting with Philippe. So apparently, Philippe's house had been robbed the day before, and Philippe believed Lionel, the bouncer, was the one who had done it. Now, Lionel immediately acted totally taken aback and began to ask Philippe, why in the world would he even think that? But Mike, his buddy here, just cut him off. And he's like, Lionel, don't play dumb. Philippe knows you're sleeping with his wife, Natalie. And Natalie is actually the one who's blaming you for this robbery. Now, at this, Lionel went from this sort of shock and awe reaction to actually just feeling really nervous. He actually began to sweat because, he knew it was true. He had slept with Natalie. He'd met her at a club one night a couple of months ago, and they'd hooked up in the coat check room. But Lionel realistically had a lot of flings with a lot of different women. And he'd actually pretty much completely forgotten about hooking up with Natalie, since it had just been like a casual thing and he hadn't seen her in weeks. And so he had no idea why now, suddenly, she would be accusing him of theft. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to him. So Lionel, he was genuinely stunned. He knew what he had done. He had slept with Natalie, and that's problematic. But he told Mike very truthfully that he did not break into Philippe's house. Like, there was nothing going on between he and Natalie. That was just a fling. It was nothing. Like, I really didn't do this. But Mike, despite, being friends with Lionel and knowing him quite well, did not appear to believe him. He just sort of narrowed his eyes and nodded and said, "Okay, I'll pass that along to Philippe." 3 days later, on the night of April 29th, Lionel sat in a chair in his living room in Chambéry, finishing up a phone call. So he lived in a small apartment with his mother and also his nephew, Julien. However, Julien was just 4 years younger than him, so in many ways they were more like brothers. And so as soon as Lionel hung up the phone, Julien, who was sitting in the room with him on the other side on the couch watching TV, he immediately asked Lionel, "Who were you talking to?" Lionel got up and he walked over and sat down next to Julien on the couch. And then he said to him, "Oh, that was my friend Mike. And he had just called to see if I wanted to go out tonight for a drink." And so Julien's like, "Okay, cool." And then there's a little bit of silence. And then Lionel was like, "Actually, I want to tell you something." And then he filled in Julien on the weird conversation he had with Mike just a few days before, where basically Mike was saying that, Lionel was being accused of robbing this rich guy's home, Philippe's home. And so Julien, when he heard this, he was sort of like, this seems like a big deal. But Lionel, despite being the one to bring it up and being the one to indicate this could be a big deal, he quickly downplayed it when he saw the reaction and was just like, it is what it is. I didn't do it. And, me and Mike were back on good terms. This whole thing was just, a misunderstanding. Everything is back to normal now. Just a weird thing that happened. And so Lionel and Julien, they shifted the conversation and chatted about whatever for the next couple of minutes. And then Lionel's phone buzzed, and at the same time, he saw there were headlights pulling up outside. So Lionel grabbed his jacket and he told Julien he'd be back in a few hours. Then he went out the door. 2 days later, on the evening of May 1st, 2012, Lionel's nephew, Julien, walked into the Chambéry police station. He had spent the past 2 days very worried and stressed because Lionel had not come home after hanging out with Mike that night, and he now was not answering his phone. And Lionel was never gone for this long without giving Julien or his mother a heads up. Julien had tried to convince himself that he was just overreacting to this whole thing and that Lionel could take care of himself. He was an adult. He was a tough adult, he could handle himself. However, when he found out that Lionel also hadn't been at work for the past couple of days, Julien knew something was wrong. So Julien, after getting inside the station, he walked right up to the front desk and told them, "I need to report somebody missing." The following afternoon, so May 2nd, 2012, Captain Florent Mazarin walked into an interrogation room at the Chambéry police station. He was leading the investigation into Lionel's missing person case, and sitting inside of the interrogation room at the table was, so far, the only suspect they had in this case, Lionel's friend, Mike Bouffe, who he had gone out with on the night he had disappeared. So it had only been a few days since anyone had seen Lionel, but Mazarin was already sure that there was foul play involved. Chambéry was a small town, and a lot of the officers on the police force there knew Lionel, and a couple of them were pretty much adamant that Lionel was just not the kind of person who would just leave town with no warning. Julien, Lionel's nephew, had said the exact same thing when he reported Lionel missing. He also was the one who told police that the last person Lionel was with was Mike on the night he went missing. And Mike also, they found out, had recently accused Lionel of robbing someone's house. So Mazarin was really eager to get in there and hear what Mike had to say. So into the room he went. He sat down across from Mike, who seemed calm, but also definitely curious, like he wasn't sure even why he was there. And when Mazarin started in by asking him about the robbery that supposedly Lionel was involved in, Mike just nodded and explained that the break-in had happened about a week earlier at the home of his good friend, Philippe Perrier. And when Mazarin heard that name, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because like basically everybody else in Chambéry, Mazarin knew who the Perriers were. And he was surprised that someone so rich and so powerful would be running in the same circles as, sort of traditional working class men like Mike and like Lionel. However, before he could dive in and ask some basic follow-up questions about how he knows the Perriers, Mike went on to say that he ran an electrician business and he had a warehouse that was right next to Philippe's winery. So they saw each other all the time. And he said that Philippe knew Mike was friends with Lionel, and so after this break-in and robbery happened, he had asked Mike to talk to Lionel about it because he was suspicious that he had done it. But Mike said when he actually confronted Lionel just a few days ago and brought up the break-in, that Lionel had sworn he didn't know anything about it. And Mike had passed that on to Philippe, and as far as he knew, that had been the end of it. Like, they were not going to continue to assume that Lionel had anything to do with it. Now, Mike was being so earnest as he told the story that Mazarin thought there was a good chance he was simply telling the truth here, and that this robbery thing was really just a big misunderstanding. However, when Mazarin asked Mike where he had been on Sunday night, when Lionel was last seen, presumably with Mike, Mike's whole demeanor changed. He began to visibly shift in his seat and began looking down at the table instead of eye contact with Mazarin, and then he just said that he had been home all night with his girlfriend. He did say at a certain point he had called Lionel to try to make plans with him for that night, but they'd never actually met up and they didn't see each other. Now, at this point, Mazarin was pretty confident that Mike was lying, not just because of Mike's very obvious change in body language, but Lionel's nephew had sworn he had seen Mike's car outside their building on that night that Mike is saying he did not meet up with Lionel. Now, it was possible that Julien had been mistaken, but if Mike was lying to the police about having been with Lionel on the night he disappeared, well, that made Mike seem very, very suspicious. And so Mazarin just put Mike on the spot and said, okay, give me your girlfriend's name and her contact information so I can confirm your alibi. And so he did, he handed it over, and then Mazarin got up, left the interrogation room, and went to go give her a call. This is a paid partnership with ZocDoc. On this channel, we often dig into cases where people brushed off pretty obvious warning signs and convinced themselves that everything was fine, until it wasn't. Well, the truth is, our own health is no different. We know we should see a doctor, but the problem is often just finding one. That can feel like a whole second job sometimes. I mean, you probably know the feeling. I mean, I've definitely been guilty of putting off an appointment simply because I didn't want to deal with the process of finding a care provider. If I had had like one place where I could check insurance, read reviews, and book online, I very likely would have gotten it done a whole lot sooner. Well, ZocDoc is a free website that changes the way you find and book doctors. Search for local in-network providers, filter by insurance, read verified patient reviews, and see real appointment availability all in one. No phone calls, no hold music, just find someone, see their availability, and book instantly online. 150,000 providers across 200 plus specialties in all 50 states. Appointments usually happen within 24 to 72 hours. Don't let a warning sign turn into something you wish you could have caught sooner. Take care of yourself. Go to ZocDoc.com/MrBallin or click the link in the description to find a doctor and book an appointment today. Thanks again to ZocDoc. On the evening of May 2nd, 2012, so just a few hours after questioning Mike Bouffe about Lionel's disappearance, Captain Mazarin drove up to a big house in a quiet, wealthy suburb just outside of Chambéry, France. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Mike's girlfriend, who had confirmed what Mazarin was already thinking, which was Mike was lying about spending the whole night of Lionel's disappearance at home with her. In fact, she said that Mike hadn't been home at all. She said she had been at home by herself all night. She had watched a movie, and then at some point she had fallen asleep, maybe around midnight. And at that point, when she fell asleep, Mike still was not back from wherever he was. So right now, Mike was not only their sole suspect, but he was also their best suspect. Mazarin knew that a few days before Lionel's disappearance, Mike had confronted Lionel about this supposed robbery at Philippe Perrier's house. And so now Mazarin was at Philippe's house to see what he had to say about the whole situation. And so Mazarin pulled his car up in front of the house, he parked, he got out, he walked up to the front door, and he rang the doorbell. And a moment later, Philippe himself opened the door. And he seemed genuinely surprised to see Mazarin standing there. And so he quickly asked Mazarin if he was here to follow up on the robbery investigation. And Mazarin said, sort of. Mazarin said for now, he just wanted to know if he could come inside and they could chat. And for a moment, it seemed, at least to Mazarin, that Philippe sort of hesitated, like he didn't necessarily want to do that. But then he sort of relaxed and nodded and said, sure. And he let Mazarin inside. And so Mazarin, he stepped inside of this beautiful house that was very well furnished, and he was led to the living room. And Mazarin took a seat, and then after Philippe sat down as well, he asked Philippe to walk him through what had happened with the supposed robbery. Philippe explained that his wife Natalie had come home one afternoon, and when she had come into the living room, she saw one of the windows had been shattered. And then Mazarin said that, after seeing this, they searched the house and they eventually went downstairs to the basement where their safe was, and they found their safe had been broken into as well, and a lot of cash that had been in there was gone. Philippe said he had called the police about it and they'd come out to investigate, but so far he hadn't heard anything. And so Mazarin, after hearing this, asked Philippe if he thought he knew who was responsible. And Philippe immediately nodded and said yes. Then he repeated what Mike Bouffe had said. It was Lionel Veronese. And the reason he knew that was Lionel was having an affair with his wife Natalie, and Natalie said it was Lionel. Mazarin looked really hard at Philippe because this was huge. If Philippe knew that Lionel was having an affair with his wife, that gave him, Philippe, plenty of motive to want Lionel dead. And as of right now, Lionel was gone and no one knew what happened to him, so maybe he was murdered. And so, operating on a hunch, Mazarin followed up by asking Philippe if he had any weapons in the house. And to his surprise, Philippe said yes. And so Mazarin asked if he could see them. And so Philippe got up and led him over to the stairs that went down to the basement. And when they got down there was this huge gun safe with a few plastic firearm cases stacked around it. And so Philippe, once they got down there, he sort of stepped out of the way so that Mazarin could look around. And almost as soon as he did begin walking around Mazarin and began opening up these cases, he discovered that one of those cases, which had space for 2 weapons in it, was empty. And so Mazarin asked Philippe, hey, where are the 2 guns that go in this case? And Philippe said, actually, those were stolen during the robbery. However, after hearing this, and as Mazarin is staring at this empty gun case, something just was not adding up. Philippe clearly had a motive to want to hurt Lionel, as he was having an affair with his wife. And he happened to have 2 missing guns? Now, of course, at this point, Mazarin did not know if Lionel was definitely, dead, and therefore couldn't know if he had been shot or not. But still, this was really suspicious. But at the same time, Philippe was from this very wealthy and highly respected family. He didn't really seem like the kind of person who would go around murdering or kidnapping people in revenge. And if he had, let's say, done something bad to Lionel, it was just odd that he would just so readily admit to clearly having a motive to harm Lionel and to show the detective a basement full of weapons, including a gun case that was missing weapons. And so, basically, until Mazarin was able to figure out what actually happened to Lionel, until that time, he would have a really hard time proving that Philippe had anything to do with it. The next morning, Captain Mazarin was in his office at the police station, going over the notes from his interview with Philippe to see if there was anything he missed. At this point, Mazarin's theory was that either Mike or Philippe or maybe even both of them, had gone to confront Lionel about the affair and about the robbery, and then things had turned violent. But just then, there was a knock on his door, and Mazarin turned and he saw his door was open, and there was this woman standing there, and her face was stained with tears, and when she walked into the room, she sort of was heavy and stumbling, like she was maybe on drugs or maybe drunk or maybe on heavy medication. And she sort of stumbled into the room and then introduced herself as Natalie Perrier. So Mazarin had actually earlier called on her to come in and speak to him, both to verify her husband's story about what happened, the robbery, the affair, and also to see what else she might know about Lionel. And also, since she clearly was involved in this whole potential love triangle here, he had to also consider her as a potential suspect in whatever happened to Lionel. So he gestured for Natalie to take a seat, and then once she had, he asked her to tell him all about how she had met Lionel. Natalie, at this point, really clearly could not sort of keep herself together. She kept apologizing and kept explaining that she was on prescription medication that made it really hard for her to keep a grip on her emotions, and this whole situation had really rattled her. But eventually, after this sort of setup about how sorry she is and what a mess she is, she eventually tells Mazarin that she had met Lionel at a nightclub and that, yes, they had hooked up a few times, but since the last time, they hadn't seen each other, and it had been quite a while, like it was nothing. When Mazarin asked her about the robbery, she said that Lionel had told her about having serious gambling debts from playing poker, and so because of that, she had just sort of naturally suspected that he must have robbed them. She also added that, just to be clear, her and Philippe were both at their home all night on the evening that Lionel disappeared, and that if Philippe had gone to confront Lionel at any point, she did not know anything about it. And so at this point, Mazarin sat back in his chair and just considered what he was seeing and what he was hearing. Natalie seemed genuinely devastated by this whole situation. To Mazarin, it seemed like she was believable, that she was coming in here telling the truth. And so he really doubted that she directly had anything to do with Lionel's disappearance. However, while Natalie's emotional state certainly made her seem less likely as a suspect, Mazarin wondered if maybe her tears were a clue. By her own account, she'd only had a fleeting relationship with Lionel, not some, passionate relationship or something. So maybe the reason she's this upset is because she actually knows that her husband was involved in what happened to Lionel. A few days later, Captain Mazarin walked through a wooded rural area near the coast, 220 miles away from Chambéry. An officer from the Marseille police was walking a few steps ahead of him. This officer had called Mazarin yesterday to tell him that a body had been discovered in these woods just after dawn on April 30th, so less than 10 hours after Lionel was last seen by his family. And after running the body's fingerprints through the database, they had identified the victim. It was Lionel. And Mazarin was baffled by this. Marseille was more than a 4-hour drive from Chambéry. And as far as Mazarin knew, Lionel didn't know anybody in Marseille and did not go there with any regularity. And there was just plenty of other wooded areas closer to Chambéry. So why drive all the way out here? It just didn't really make any sense. And so Mazarin continued following this officer, and at some point, they stepped into this small clearing, and Mazarin saw there was a pile of burnt logs and branches sort of lying in the grass right in the middle, and the other officer said that this was the spot where Lionel was found. And then the officer pulled out a folder that had photos of Lionel's body. And so Mazarin was being brought here just to see exactly where it had been found. And so Mazarin looked down at the photo, and what he saw was, in the spot that he was standing near, there was this smoldering bonfire. It was clearly out, but there was still smoke coming off of it. And then in the middle of all these logs was clearly a charred corpse. The officer that brought him here explained that the medical examiner had found a gunshot wound in the back of Lionel's head. So it did appear that he was actually killed before he was set on fire. And so as Mazarin was taking all this new information in, everything just started to make sense. So this was exactly how drug trafficking gangs in France typically disposed of bodies. The police even had a name for it. They called it a barbecue. The gangs would shoot their victims in the head and then burn their bodies over a bonfire to make them harder to identify. Mazarin had assumed that Lionel's murder was a revenge killing. But now it actually looked more likely that this could have been a gang execution. None of Lionel's family or friends had ever mentioned that he was involved with a gang in any way, but Mazarin knew that Lionel worked in nightclubs and had a history of breaking up fights, so it was definitely possible that he might have crossed paths with the wrong person. Also, there was the fact that apparently Lionel had these huge debts from gambling. There's just sort of a seedy underworld that potentially he was around that could have led to him being killed this way. Also, if this was gang-related, it would sort of explain why he was all the way out here in Marseille, because Marseille was a city that historically had a lot of issues with drug trafficking and gangs. And so Mazarin realized he could have been wrong about this case basically from the start. Maybe Mike and Philippe actually had nothing to do with it at all. Around 10 p.m. on May 5th, 2012, about 100 miles from the spot where Lionel's body was found, Captain Florent Mazarin pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. He got out, he walked inside, and told the clerk that he needed to look at the security camera footage. So during the 4-hour drive from Marseille back to Chambéry, so after Mazarin had gone out and seen where Lionel had been found, during that ride home, he had been going back and forth between his first two suspects, Mike and Philippe, and this new theory that a gang had killed Lionel. And so he wasn't really sure how he was going to navigate, like what to do here with running these two sort of simultaneous investigations. But as he's driving, as he's on his way back home, he realizes there might actually be a way to prove whether or not either Mike or Philippe were involved in this killing. There were only two roads that connected Chambéry to Marseille. And so Lionel's killer or killers must have driven down one of them at some point during the night of April 29th. So Mazarin had been checking the cameras at every toll booth and every gas station that he passed on his drive to see if any of them had captured a glimpse of Lionel. So far, he'd just been disappointed because most of the cameras didn't even work, or the footage had already been erased or written over. And so now, as he followed this clerk into the back room and was shown to their computer to go ahead and look at the footage, Mazarin was expecting that this stop would be the same as all the others, a big disappointment. However, as soon as they fired up the computer, right away Mazarin saw that they did have footage, and the footage did cover the time period he was looking for. However, when he began scanning the footage around the date of April 29th, April 30th, at first, nothing stood out. However, when he reached the early hours of April 30th, where he would normally stop and say, okay, I didn't see anything, it is what it is, for whatever reason, he decided to just keep on scanning the footage, just keep on watching more of April 30th. And eventually, he did see something of interest. At 5:43 a.m. on April 30th, a black Volkswagen vehicle pulls into frame, and it actually parks in the gas station parking lot. And this car, its license plate ended in 73, which meant this car was registered in Chambéry. He's watching this car, comes into the lot, it parks, and the driver gets out. And right away, Mazarin pauses the video and he zooms in on the driver's face, but the video was just too grainy. He couldn't tell who the driver was. But then something in the passenger seat of this car catches his attention. And so he zoomed in on the passenger seat, and when he realized what he was looking at, his stomach just dropped. Based on that video, forensic evidence, and interviews with witnesses, this is what police believe happened to Lionel Varonese on April 29th, 2012. Around 10:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car as it drove through the streets of Chambéry with a gun resting on the seat next to them. Now, the killer had told the driver that they were not planning to use the gun tonight. It was just there for intimidation. However, the killer's emotions were really running high, and they honestly weren't even sure what they were going to do when they saw Lionel. And so the car kept on driving along until eventually it came to a stop outside of an apartment building, and then a few seconds later, the passenger side front door opened up and Lionel climbed inside the car. As the driver put the car back into gear and started driving down the road, the killer from the back seat confronted Lionel about something that had really been bothering them, and it gradually turned into a very heated argument. And then, at some point, the killer raised that gun they weren't going to use, aimed at the back of Lionel's head, and fired. The driver immediately whipped around and looked at the killer and just stared at them. They seemed completely shocked by this crazy sudden escalation here, but they didn't stop driving. Instead, they stepped on the gas and sped down the road until they reached a house. And then the killer and the driver both went inside of that house and they formulated a plan for what would happen next. So the plan was the driver, along with another accomplice who was in the house they went to, would drive down to Marseille. They would find a secluded spot out in the woods, they'd make a bonfire, and they would burn Lionel's body. That's how they dispose of it. And then on the way back, their plan was to toss all the evidence into the river. As for the killer, the one who actually pulled the trigger, they were going to stay at this house. They were not going to leave. The driver and the other accomplice agreed that the killer had already caused enough trouble for one night. So the killer just went upstairs into their bedroom, they slipped on a robe, and they watched from the window as the other two got into the car and drove off. The killer was Philippe's wife, Natalie Perrier, the woman Lionel had had an affair with. To Lionel, their affair had been meaningless, just a fling. But for Natalie, she wanted more. She had gotten bored of her quiet life as a luxurious housewife in the suburbs, and she'd quickly fallen in love with Lionel and the seemingly very exciting life that he lived. And so when Lionel stopped paying attention to her, she'd gotten so mad that she took revenge. She went with Mike to pick up Lionel on the night he was killed so that she could confront him. But moments after Lionel got in the car, her emotions got the best of her, and she shot and killed him. And this was definitely not the plan that Mike had agreed to. Like, he and her had discussed what was going to happen. It didn't include murdering Lionel. But after the murder, Mike didn't say, "I'm going to go to the police." Instead, he and Natalie went to her husband, Philippe, for help. And Philippe agreed to dispose of Lionel's body and cover up the crime. On the security footage from the gas station, what Mazarin saw in the passenger seat of that black Volkswagen was Philippe. He was sitting there, just right in the passenger seat. And it would turn out the driver of the car was Mike. Natalie was ultimately convicted of Lionel's murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike was sentenced to 6 years for kidnapping and destroying evidence, and Philippe was sentenced to 3 years for helping get rid of Lionel's body. He and Natalie are now divorced, and also, as for that robbery that played seemingly a central role in the story at the beginning, we actually don't know if the robbery ever occurred or if it was simply a fabrication. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
In early March of 1975, a team of police officers was walking through Bathpool Park in Staffordshire, England. It was late at night, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The officers swept the dense recreation area, with flashlights, their boots sinking deep into the mud. The park was vast, filled with tall trees, overgrown brush, and empty pathways. They walked in total silence, listening only to the crunch of frost and distant traffic. After trudging through the trees for an hour, they reached a clearing near the edge of the park. In the center sat a square concrete structure, protruding slightly from the earth, covered by a rusted iron grate. It was an access point for an old drainage network deep underneath the park. An officer stepped onto the concrete lip, knelt in the mud, and grabbed the iron bars. He pulled with all his strength, the metal groaning loudly against the concrete until the heavy grate scraped backward and flipped open. A sudden blast of cold air rushed up from the hole, carrying the smell of stagnant water and decaying leaves. The officer leaned over the edge and pointed his flashlight straight down. The bright beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a vertical concrete shaft that dropped 50 feet straight into the earth. At the bottom, the light reflected off a pool of fast-moving water. He moved his flashlight along the concrete wall, illuminating a rusted metal ladder bolted to the side leading down to the water. But as the beam traced the rungs, it hit something that did not belong there. Fastened securely to a thick metal rung about halfway down the shaft was a heavy steel padlock, and clamped inside the padlock was a thick industrial wire rope. The officers stared at it in complete silence. The wire was pulled taut, stretching away from the ladder and dropping straight down into the absolute darkness below. They could not see what was attached to the other end, but they knew they had to climb down to find out. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, please invite the like button to a fancy dinner order, the most expensive items on the menu, and then politely excuse yourself to use the restroom right before the check arrives. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get into today's story. In January of 1975, 17-year-old Leslie Whittle lived in a stately stone house in the quiet town of Highley, located in Shropshire, England. The property sat on a sprawling piece of land enclosed by a tall brick wall. Leslie lived in this massive house with her mother, Dorothy. Her father, a prominent businessman, had passed away a few years prior, leaving his family the sole owners of a highly successful national transport business. Because of this, the Whittle family was very wealthy. It was public knowledge in the local community that Leslie had inherited a substantial sum of money, making her a wealthy heiress at a very young age. But despite her financial status, Leslie did not live a flashy lifestyle. She was a very reserved teenager who strongly preferred the comfort of her own home. She spent the vast majority of her time in her bedroom listening to records, studying for exams, or sitting in the kitchen helping her mother cook. She had a close-knit group of friends and mostly kept to herself. On the evening of January 13th, 1975, Leslie finished her homework at the heavy oak table in the kitchen. She gathered her books, had a brief conversation with her mother about her plans for the upcoming weekend, and then walked upstairs to her bedroom to read. Her mother stayed downstairs in the living room watching television for another hour. When the program ended, Dorothy locked the heavy wooden front door, turned off all the lights on the ground floor, and headed upstairs to her bedroom. Around 2 in the morning, Dorothy woke up suddenly in the pitch black. She had heard the distinct heavy thud of a door slamming shut somewhere on the ground floor. She lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling and listening to the absolute silence of the large house. The winter wind was blowing fiercely outside, rattling the glass panes in the window frames. Dorothy assumed the noise she heard was just a strong draft blowing an unlatched door shut in the kitchen. She rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, Dorothy woke up early and walked downstairs in her robe to make a pot of tea. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, she immediately noticed that the heavy wooden front door was standing wide open. The freezing morning air was blowing directly into the main hallway, scattering some loose papers across the floor. She hurried over to shut the door, confused as to how it could have blown open. But as she reached for the brass handle, she saw a piece of paper lying face down on the rug near the threshold. Dorothy knelt down and picked up the paper. She flipped it over and saw a message composed entirely of letters punched out on plastic Dymo tape, the kind of stiff tape used in manual label makers. The message was blunt and highly specific. It demanded £50,000 in exchange for Leslie. It instructed the family to absolutely not contact the police and to wait for a phone call that evening at a specific public telephone box in a nearby town. Dorothy dropped the note on the floor, turned around, and ran up the stairs. She pushed open the door to Leslie's bedroom and stopped in the doorway. The bed was unmade, the sheets were pulled back carelessly, and Leslie's slippers were still sitting neatly on the floor near the nightstand. The window was closed, and her clothes from the previous day were folded on a chair. But the room was completely empty. Leslie was gone. Dorothy ran to the phone in the hallway and immediately called her adult son Ronald, who lived in a different house nearby. She told him to come over immediately because someone had taken Leslie. Ronald arrived at the house within 20 minutes. He read the ransom note and, completely ignoring the kidnapper's explicit warning, he picked up the phone and dialed the police. Within an hour, dozens of plainclothes detectives were swarming the Whittle property. They searched the grounds meticulously and found a wooden ladder leaning against the tall brick wall outside. Near the ladder, they discovered a set of deep, heavy boot prints in the mud, leading away from the house toward the main road. The police knew this was not a random crime. The investigators knew they were dealing with a highly organized criminal. The ransom note was precise, and the kidnapper had bypassed the home security system without making a sound. The police installed recording equipment on the Whittle family's phone lines and briefed Ronald on exactly what he needed to do when the kidnapper made contact. Late that evening, the phone in the hallway rang. Ronald picked it up while the detectives listened in. A man with a deep, calm voice instructed Ronald to pack 50,000 pounds into a suitcase. The caller told Ronald to drive to a public phone box in the town of Kidderminster. He said he would ring that specific phone box in exactly 1 hour, with further instructions. He warned Ronald that if any police vehicles were spotted, the deal was off. Ronald packed the money, carried it to his car, and drove into the freezing night. Unmarked police cars followed him at a distance. Ronald arrived at the phone box, stepped inside the glass booth, and stared at the rotary dial. He waited for 2 hours, but the phone never rang. The next day, a local radio station broadcasted a breaking news bulletin about heavy police activity near the Whittle estate. A reporter had noticed the unmarked cars and published a story speculating that the missing transport heiress had been kidnapped. The police detectives were absolutely furious. The broadcast had completely blown their cover. They assumed the kidnapper had heard the radio bulletin, realized the police were involved, and aborted the phone box drop. There was nothing they could do but wait for another call. 3 days later, the phone at the house rang again. Ronald answered. It was the same man, but his voice was much more agitated this time. He instructed Ronald to take the suitcase to a different location, a phone box in the village of Kinver. He gave Ronald a strict 30-minute time limit to get there. Ronald sprinted out the front door, threw the heavy suitcase into the passenger seat of his car, and sped out of the driveway. The unmarked police cars scrambled to keep up with him, coordinating over the radio to remain completely unseen. Ronald reached the village of Kinver just in time. He stepped inside the phone box and waited. The phone rang almost immediately. The kidnapper told Ronald to drive to a specific park on the edge of town, look for a flashing white light in the trees, and leave the suitcase by a low stone wall. Ronald drove to the park, got out with the suitcase, and began walking toward the dark tree line. The police were positioned a few hundred yards away, watching him through high-powered binoculars as he approached the stone wall. But right as Ronald looked for the flashing light, a local security guard patrolling the park in a marked van drove around the corner. The van's bright headlights swept across the trees. The police watched helplessly as the headlights illuminated a man standing just inside the tree line, only 50 yards from Ronald. The man was holding a flashlight and wearing a dark mask over his face. As soon as the security van's lights hit him, the man turned and sprinted deep into the woods. Ronald shouted into the darkness, but the man was gone. Weeks turned into a full month. The police launched a massive nationwide search for Leslie. They searched thousands of homes, barns, and abandoned buildings across the entire country. They interviewed hundreds of known criminals. The press began linking the kidnapping to a notorious phantom burglar they called the Black Panther, a highly skilled criminal who had recently committed a string of violent robberies. But despite the massive manhunt and the public outcry, the police found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of Leslie anywhere above ground. The police and the family were completely baffled. They had no idea where a kidnapper could keep a 17-year-old girl hidden for over a month without anyone seeing or hearing a single thing. Then on March 6th, a group of children were playing in Bathpool Park, a large wooded recreation area just a few miles from the second ransom drop site. One of the boys was digging in the dirt near a concrete drainage structure when he found a strip of plastic Dymo tape. He wiped the thick mud off and read it. It was a list of instructions about delivering a suitcase. The boy took the plastic tape to his father, who immediately recognized its significance and called the police. Investigators rushed to Bathpool Park and realized the concrete structure was the main entrance to a vast subterranean drainage network. They pried open the heavy iron grate and shined their flashlights down the deep vertical shaft. They saw the rusted metal ladder and the thick wire rope plunging down into the darkness. Using forensic evidence, police records, and subsequent legal proceedings, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Leslie Whittle. On the night of January 13th, the kidnapper climbed over the brick wall of the Whittle estate, carrying a bag of tools. He easily bypassed the home's alarm system, picked the heavy lock on the back door, and crept up the wooden stairs. He entered Leslie's bedroom, woke her up, and forced her out of bed at gunpoint. He did not give her time to put on her shoes or grab a coat. He marched her quietly down the stairs, out the front door, and into the freezing winter night, leaving the heavy door standing wide open behind them. He forced her into the trunk of his car and drove for nearly an hour until he reached Bathpool Park. He parked his car near the tree line and pulled her out of the trunk. He led her barefoot through the dark, muddy woods until they reached the heavy iron grate of the drainage shaft. He pulled the grate open and ordered her to climb down the rusted metal ladder into the pitch-black hole. Leslie climbed down 50 feet until she reached a narrow concrete landing. The landing was just inches above a subterranean pool of rushing, freezing water. The kidnapper climbed down the ladder right behind her. Once they were on the narrow ledge, he took a heavy wire rope and wrapped it around her neck, securing it tightly with a steel padlock. He then bolted the other end of the wire to the base of the metal ladder. He placed a thin sleeping bag and a small piece of foam mattress on the concrete ledge. He told her to stay on the platform. If she stepped off the edge, the wire was short enough that she would hang in the darkness. Then he turned around and climbed back up the ladder. He climbed out of the shaft and slid the heavy iron grate back into place, sealing her in complete blackness underground. For days, Leslie sat on that extremely narrow ledge in the freezing cold, surrounded by the deafening sound of rushing water. She had no light, no shoes, and no idea if anyone was coming to save her. The kidnapper returned a few times to drop down food and a flashlight on a rope, but after the botched ransom drop involving the security van, he panicked and fled the area. He never came back to the shaft. At some point during her confinement in the absolute dark, Leslie lost her footing on the narrow concrete ledge. She slipped off the edge and fell into the empty void. The heavy wire rope snapped tight around her neck. But she did not die from strangulation. The sudden, violent physical shock of the fall caused a rapid physiological reaction in her body. The severe jolt overstimulated her vagus nerve, which instantly stopped her heart before the wire even pulled completely tight around her throat. She died instantly of vagal inhibition, suspended in the dark. When the police finally descended the rusted ladder in March, they found her body hanging just above the black water. The kidnapper, a master burglar and serial killer named Donald Nielsen, had kept her tethered in a subterranean pipe while the entire country searched frantically for her above ground. In December of 1975, 2 police officers spotted a suspicious man walking near a post office. When they approached him, the man pulled out a shotgun and opened fire. After a violent physical struggle, the officers managed to disarm and arrest him. It was Donald Nielsen. He was eventually convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Leslie Whittle, along with 3 other murders, and received 4 consecutive life sentences. Nielsen spent the rest of his life inside a highly secured prison cell, locked away from the public. But a year later, in a quiet town across the English Channel, another young life would be taken by a man who did not hide in the shadows, but instead chose to stand directly in front of the television cameras. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon in late January of 1976, a woman named Sylvie parked her car along a narrow cobblestone street in Troyes, France. Troyes was an old industrial town built around massive knitwear factories. Most of the residents worked in the textile mills, and they all walked the same routes to work every single day. People bought their bread from the same bakeries every morning and left their bicycles leaning against the stone walls without chains. Sylvie was the wife of a wealthy factory owner, but she kept a very rigid, quiet daily routine. She did not like to draw attention to herself or her family. On this particular afternoon, the sky was a heavy flat gray, and a bitter wind was blowing off the nearby Seine River, rattling the street signs. Sylvie left the engine running because the winter air was biting. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, staring at the heavy wooden doors of her 7-year-old son's school. It was exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. The school bell rang a loud, metallic clanging that echoed down the narrow street. Dozens of children in heavy wool coats and thick scarves poured out of the wooden doors, running toward their parents who were waiting on the sidewalks. Sylvie watched the crowd closely, waiting to see Philippe's bright red winter jacket. She kept the heater blowing on her feet and tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, expecting him to run up to the passenger side door at any second. 10 minutes passed. The crowd of children slowly thinned out. The parents grabbed their kids by the hands and walked away down the sidewalks. The street grew quiet again, and only a few teachers remained near the exit, pulling the heavy doors shut. Sylvie turned off the engine, got out of her car, and walked up the stone steps into the school courtyard. She found Philippe's teacher stacking chairs in a classroom on the first floor. When Sylvie asked where her son was, the teacher stopped and looked confused. The teacher said Philippe had run out the front doors with the very first group of children the moment the bell rang. He had been gone for 15 minutes. Sylvie walked back out to the street. Her hands began to shake inside her coat pockets. She checked the alleys next to the school. She walked around the entire block, looking into the windows of the local bakeries and pharmacies. There was no sign of the red jacket anywhere. She ran back to her car and drove home, hoping maybe he had decided to walk back to the house on his own. But the large stone house was completely empty. She picked up the phone and called her husband, who immediately left the factory and called the police. Within an hour, local authorities were knocking on the doors of every house in the neighborhood. They searched the local parks and the banks of the river with flashlights, sweeping the beams of light across the freezing water. They found nothing. The next morning, the heavy rotary phone in the Bertrand family's living room rang. The police had already attached recording devices to the receiver, and a detective signaled for Philippe's father to pick it up. On the other end, a muffled, heavily disguised voice spoke very slowly. The caller stated that they had Philippe. The demand was 1 million francs, to be delivered in a specific duffel bag. The caller gave strict instructions not to involve the police and then immediately hung up the receiver. The ransom demand was followed by a written letter dropped in a local mailbox a few hours later, confirming the exact amount and the threat. The police set up a massive covert operation. They knew the kidnapper was likely local, someone who knew the Bertrand family had the liquid cash to pay 1 million francs without needing to go to a bank for a loan. They started pulling in everyone who had a connection to the family or the factory. During their neighborhood canvass, a local shopkeeper mentioned seeing a white car parked near the school gates, right around 4:30 on the day Philippe vanished. The police checked local vehicle registrations and cross-referenced them with the family's known contacts. They found that a 22-year-old man named Patrick Henry, who was a casual acquaintance of the Bertrand family, drove a white car matching that exact description. The police brought Patrick in for questioning that same afternoon. He walked into the interrogation room chewing a piece of gum. He sat down, crossed his arms, and leaned back in his wooden chair. He was wearing a fitted suit and smiled politely at the detectives across the metal table. When they asked him where he was on Tuesday afternoon, he provided a highly detailed timeline. He said he had been looking at an apartment to rent on the other side of town, and then he had stopped at a local cafe for a drink. The detectives sent officers to check his alibi, and a few people loosely corroborated that they had seen him around town that day. The police then searched his white car and found absolutely nothing inside. The seats were clean, the trunk was empty, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the school. They had no boy, no ransom money, and no reason to hold him. So after 48 hours, they let Patrick walk out the front door. By this time, the kidnapping of the wealthy industrialist's son had become major national news. When Patrick walked out of the police station, the street was packed with television crews, bright camera lights, and reporters holding heavy microphones. Most people who are questioned in a high-profile child abduction case pull their coats over their heads, run to their cars, and try to avoid the cameras. But Patrick did not do that. He stopped on the top step of the police station. He adjusted his jacket, looked directly into the camera lenses, and walked right up to the reporters, standing directly in the glare of the television lights. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him and asked what it was like to be suspected of such a crime. Patrick shook his head and sighed loudly. He said it was a terrible misunderstanding, but he completely understood why the police had to question him. He said he was a friend of the family, and his heart broke for Philippe's parents. Then, looking directly into the television camera, Patrick stated that he sincerely hoped the police would catch whoever took the boy. He leaned into the microphone and said that anyone who would kidnap a child deserves the death penalty. He stayed on the street for 20 minutes, answering every single question, shaking hands with the reporters, and expressing his deep sympathy for the missing boy. Back inside the station, a group of plainclothes detectives were watching the live broadcast on a small television set resting on a filing cabinet. One of the senior investigators stood with his arms crossed, staring at the screen. He watched Patrick speak. He noticed that Patrick's shoulders were completely relaxed. His tone was perfectly smooth. He was not sweating under the heavy camera lights. He seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the attention. The investigator decided right then that he did not care about the loose alibi. He ordered a team of unmarked cars to follow Patrick the moment he left the cameras. For the next 2 days, the detectives trailed Patrick from a distance. They sat in their freezing cars, drinking stale coffee, watching him through binoculars. They watched him go to a local bakery, buy a newspaper, and sit in a cafe, reading the articles about the kidnapping. He laughed with the waitress. He drove his white car at exactly the speed limit, always using his turn signals. He did not go to any hidden drop sites, and he did not make any calls from public payphones. But on the third evening, the tailing officers noticed a slight deviation in his routine. Instead of driving back to his own apartment in the center of town, Patrick drove to the outskirts of the city and parked in front of a small rundown boarding house called the Hotel des Trois Chouettes. He walked inside and went up the stairs to the second floor. The detectives parked down the street in the dark and waited. They sent an officer around the back to check the hotel registry with the owner. The owner confirmed that Patrick had rented a single room on the second floor a few weeks prior, paying for the entire month in cash. The police decided they could not sit in their cars anymore. If Philippe was being held in that room, they needed to move in immediately. A team of 6 officers quietly walked up the creaking wooden stairs of the boarding house. They drew their weapons in the narrow hallway and stood outside room number 7. The lead detective knocked heavily on the thin wooden door. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Patrick stood there in a white undershirt, holding a glass of cheap red wine. He looked at the 6 guns pointed at his chest, took a slow sip of his wine, backed up, and gestured for the officers to come inside. The room was incredibly small. There was a porcelain sink in the corner, a single wooden chair, a small closet, and a twin bed pushed against the far wall. The detectives tore the room apart. They pulled the clothes out of the closet. They checked the small adjoining bathroom. They opened the drawers of the single nightstand. The room was empty. There was no sign of Philippe anywhere. The lead detective stood in the center of the room, looking at Patrick. Patrick was now sitting on the wooden chair, still drinking his wine and watching the police tear his room apart with a slight smirk on his face. The detective looked down at the twin bed. The mattress was covered with a thick floral blanket that hung all the way down, touching the dusty floorboards. The detective holstered his weapon, walked over to the bed, grabbed the edge of the heavy floral blanket, and pulled it up. Lying on the floor, shoved entirely underneath the wooden bed frame, was a rolled-up piece of dark carpet. The detective pulled the carpet out into the center of the room and unrolled it on the floor. Inside the carpet was the body of 7-year-old Philippe Bertrand. He had been dead for days, and Patrick Henry had been sleeping on the mattress directly above him every single night. Based on physical evidence, police interrogations, and court transcripts, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Philippe Bertrand on the afternoon of January 31st. Patrick parked his white car down the street from the school just before the bell rang. He had spent weeks planning this entirely on his own. He was deeply in debt, trying to fund an expensive lifestyle he could not afford, and he knew the Bertrand family would pay 1 million francs without hesitation. When the heavy wooden doors opened and the children poured out, Patrick stood near the iron gates. He saw Philippe walking in his red winter jacket. Patrick simply called out his name. Because Philippe knew Patrick from family gatherings and had seen him talking to his parents, the boy did not hesitate. He walked over and Patrick offered to give him a ride down the block to his mother's car so he would not have to walk in the cold wind. Philippe got into the passenger seat and Patrick drove away before Sylvie ever reached the front doors of the school. Patrick drove the boy straight to the cheap boarding house on the edge of town. He walked Philippe up the wooden stairs and locked him inside room number 7. But Patrick had made a massive miscalculation in his plan. He had not bothered to wear a mask, and Philippe knew his exact name. Sitting in the small room, Patrick realized that if he kept the boy alive during the long ransom negotiations, Philippe would easily identify him to the police the moment the ransom was paid and the boy was returned. Patrick knew he could not let the boy walk out of that room. Less than an hour after he had picked the boy up from the school gates, Patrick took a piece of heavy fabric and strangled the 7-year-old boy. He rolled the boy's body in the small rug and pushed it far under the bed frame. Then Patrick left the boarding house, drove to a public telephone, and made the muffled ransom demand to the Bertrand family, asking for 1 million francs for the safe return of a boy he had already killed. For the next several days, Patrick lived a brazen double life. He went about his normal routine. He sat in the police interrogation room and confidently provided his fake alibi to the detectives, and he stood in front of the national television cameras demanding the death penalty for the kidnapper. And every single night, after enjoying the media spotlight and the attention of the entire country, he returned to room number 7, poured himself a glass of wine, and went to sleep on the small twin bed, perfectly aware of what was resting, just inches beneath the floorboards. Patrick Henry was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. His trial in 1977 became one of the most publicized and controversial legal battles in French history. The entire country, enraged by the arrogant television interviews, demanded that Patrick face the guillotine. But his defense attorney argued passionately against capital punishment, shifting the entire trial into a national debate on the death penalty itself. The jury ultimately spared Patrick's life, sentencing him to life in prison instead. The sheer magnitude of this trial became a major catalyst for the country, and just 4 years later, France officially abolished the guillotine and the death penalty entirely. But while this young man actively sought out the bright glare of television cameras to hide his crimes in a provincial French town, a completely different type of killer was operating on the other side of the Atlantic. This person did not want an audience at all. They only wanted to be left completely alone on a snowy Midwestern highway, completely unaware that a single strand of hair left in the winter cold would eventually catch up to them nearly 50 years later. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon in late January of 1976, a woman named Sylvie parked her car along a narrow cobblestone street in Troyes, France. Troyes was an old industrial town, built around massive knitwear factories. Most of the residents worked in the textile mills, and they all walked the same routes to work every single day. People bought their bread from the same bakeries every morning and left their bicycles leaning against the stone walls without chains. Sylvie was the wife of a wealthy factory owner, but she kept a very rigid, quiet daily routine. She did not like to draw attention to herself or her family. On this particular afternoon, the sky was a heavy, flat gray, and a bitter winter wind was blowing off the nearby Seine River, rattling the street signs. Sylvie left the engine running because the winter air was biting. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, staring at the heavy wooden doors of her 7-year-old son's school. It was exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. The school bell rang a loud metallic clanging that echoed down the narrow street. Dozens of children in heavy wool coats and thick scarves poured out of the wooden doors, running toward their parents who were waiting on the sidewalks. Sylvie watched the crowd closely, waiting to see Philippe's bright red winter jacket. She kept the heater blowing on her feet and tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, expecting him to run up to the passenger side door at any second. 10 minutes passed. The crowd of children slowly thinned out. The parents grabbed their kids by the hands and walked away down the sidewalks. The street grew quiet again, and only a few teachers remained near the exit, pulling the heavy doors shut. Sylvie turned off the engine, got out of her car, and walked up the stone steps into the school courtyard. She found Philippe's teacher stacking chairs in a classroom on the first floor. When Sylvie asked where her son was, the teacher stopped and looked confused. The teacher said Philippe had run out the front doors with the very first group of children the moment the bell rang. He had been gone for 15 minutes. Sylvie walked back out to the street. Her hands began to shake inside her coat pockets. She checked the alleys next to the school. She walked around the entire block, looking into the windows of the local bakeries and pharmacies. There was no sign of the red jacket anywhere. She ran back to her car and drove home, hoping maybe he had decided to walk back to the house on his own. But the large stone house was completely empty. She picked up the phone and called her husband, who immediately left the factory and called the police. Within an hour, local authorities were knocking on the doors of every house in the neighborhood. They searched the local parks and the banks of the river with flashlights, sweeping the beams of light across the freezing water. They found nothing. The next morning, the heavy rotary phone in the Bertrand family's living room rang. The police had already attached recording devices to the receiver, and a detective signaled for Philippe's father to pick it up. On the other end, a muffled, heavily disguised voice spoke very slowly. The caller stated that they had Philippe. The demand was 1 million francs, to be delivered in a specific duffel bag. The caller gave strict instructions not to involve the police, and then immediately hung up the receiver. The ransom demand was followed by a written letter dropped in a local mailbox a few hours later, confirming the exact amount and the instructions. The police set up a massive covert operation. They knew the kidnapper was likely local, someone who knew the Bertrand family had the liquid cash to pay 1 million francs without needing to go to a bank for a loan. They started pulling in everyone who had a connection to the family or the factory. During their neighborhood canvass, a local shopkeeper mentioned seeing a white car parked near the school gates right around 4:30 on the day Philippe vanished. The police checked local vehicle registrations and cross-referenced them with the family's known contacts. They found that a 22-year-old man, who was a casual acquaintance of the Bertrand family, drove a white car matching that exact description. The police brought this young man in for questioning that same afternoon. He walked into the interrogation room chewing a piece of gum. He sat down, crossed his arms, and leaned back in his wooden chair. He was wearing a fitted suit and smiled politely at the detectives across the metal table. When they asked him where he was on Tuesday afternoon, he provided a highly detailed timeline. He said he had been looking at an apartment to rent on the other side of town, and then he had stopped at a local cafe for a drink. The detectives sent officers to check his alibi, and a few people loosely corroborated that they had seen him around town that day. The police then searched his white car and found absolutely nothing inside. The seats were clean, the trunk was empty, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the school. They had no boy, no ransom money, and no reason to hold him. So, after 48 hours, they let the young man walk out the front door. By this time, the kidnapping of the wealthy industrialist's son had become major national news. When the young man walked out of the police station, the street was packed with television crews, bright camera lights, and reporters holding heavy microphones. Most people who are questioned in a high-profile child abduction case pull their coats over their heads, run to their cars, and try to avoid the cameras. But this 22-year-old did not do that. He stopped on the top step of the police station. He adjusted his jacket, looked directly into the camera lenses, and walked right up to the reporters, standing directly in the glare of the television lights. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him and asked what it was like to be suspected of such a crime. The young man shook his head and sighed loudly. He said it was a terrible misunderstanding, but he completely understood why the police had to question him. He said he was a friend of the family, and his heart broke for Philippe's parents. Then, looking directly into the television camera, he stated that he sincerely hoped the police would catch whoever took the boy. He leaned into the microphone and said that anyone who would kidnap a child deserves the death penalty. He stayed on the street for 20 minutes, answering every single question, shaking hands with the reporters and expressing his deep sympathy for the missing boy. The national broadcast aired that evening, and the public immediately rallied behind this articulate, upstanding citizen. Back inside the station, a group of plainclothes detectives were watching the live broadcast on a small television set, resting on a filing cabinet. One of the senior investigators stood with his arms crossed, staring at the screen. He watched the young man speak. He noticed that the man's shoulders were completely relaxed. His tone was perfectly smooth. He was not sweating under the heavy camera lights. He seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the attention. The investigator decided right then that he did not care about the loose alibi or the clean car. He ordered a team of unmarked cars to follow the young man the moment he left the cameras. For the next 2 days, the detectives trailed him from a distance. They sat in their freezing cars, drinking stale coffee, watching him through binoculars. They watched him go to a local bakery, buy a newspaper, and sit in a cafe reading the front-page articles about the kidnapping. He laughed with the waitress. He drove his white car at exactly the speed limit, always using his turn signals. He did not go to any hidden drop sites, and he did not make any calls from public payphones. He was living the life of a completely innocent man with nothing to hide. But on the third evening, the tailing officers noticed a slight deviation in his routine. Instead of driving back to his own apartment in the center of town, the young man drove to the outskirts of the city and parked in front of a small, run-down boarding house called the Hotel des Trois Chouettes. He walked inside and went up the stairs to the second floor. The detectives parked down the street in the dark and waited. They sent an officer around the back to check the hotel registry with the owner. The owner confirmed that the young man had rented a single room on the second floor a few weeks prior, paying for the entire month in cash. The police decided they could not sit in their cars anymore. If Philippe was being held in that room, they needed to move in immediately. A team of 6 officers quietly walked up the creaking wooden stairs of the boarding house. They drew their weapons in the narrow hallway and stood outside room number 7. The lead detective knocked heavily on the thin wooden door. The lock clicked and the door swung open. The young man stood there in a white undershirt, holding a glass of cheap red wine. He looked at the 6 guns pointed at his chest, took a slow sip of his wine, backed up, and gestured for the officers to come inside. The room was incredibly small. There was a porcelain sink in the corner, a single wooden chair, a small closet, and a twin bed pushed against the far wall. The detectives tore the room apart. They pulled the clothes out of the closet. They checked the small adjoining bathroom. They opened the drawers of the single nightstand. The room was empty. There was no sign of Philippe anywhere. The lead detective stood in the center of the room, looking at the young man. He was now sitting on the wooden chair, still drinking his wine and watching the police tear his room apart with a slight smirk on his face. The detective looked down at the twin bed. The mattress was covered with a thick floral blanket that hung all the way down, touching the dusty floorboards. The detective holstered his weapon, walked over to the bed, grabbed the edge of the heavy floral blanket, and pulled it up. Lying on the floor, shoved entirely underneath the wooden bed frame, was a rolled-up piece of dark carpet. The detective pulled the carpet out into the center of the room and unrolled it on the floor. Inside the carpet was the body of 7-year-old Philippe Bertrand. He had been dead for days, and the young man had been sleeping on the mattress directly above him every single night. Based on physical evidence, police interrogations, and court transcripts, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Philippe Bertrand on the afternoon of January 31st. The young man's name was Patrick Henry. Patrick parked his white car down the street from the school just before the bell rang. He had spent weeks planning this entirely on his own. He was deeply in debt, trying to fund an expensive lifestyle he could not afford, and he knew the Bertrand family would pay 1 million francs without hesitation. When the heavy wooden doors opened and the children poured out, Patrick stood near the iron gates. He saw Philippe walking in his red winter jacket. Patrick simply called out his name. Because Philippe knew Patrick from family gatherings and had seen him talking to his parents, the boy did not hesitate. He walked over, and Patrick offered to give him a ride down the block to his mother's car, so he would not have to walk in the cold wind. Philippe got into the passenger seat, and Patrick drove away before Sylvie ever reached the front doors of the school. Patrick drove the boy straight to the cheap boarding house on the edge of town. He walked Philippe up the wooden stairs and locked him inside room number 7. But Patrick had made a massive miscalculation in his plan. He had not bothered to wear a mask, and Philippe knew his exact name. Sitting in the small room, Patrick realized that if he kept the boy alive during the long ransom negotiations, Philippe would easily identify him to the police the moment the ransom was paid and the boy was returned. Patrick knew he could not let the boy walk out of that room. Less than an hour after he had picked the boy up from the school gates, Patrick took a piece of heavy fabric and strangled the 7-year-old boy. He rolled the boy's body in the small dark rug and pushed it far under the bed frame. Then Patrick left the boarding house, drove to a public telephone, and made the muffled ransom demand to the Bertrand family, asking for 1 million francs for the safe return of a boy he had already killed. For the next several days, Patrick lived a brazen double life. He went about his normal routine. He sat in the police interrogation room and confidently provided his fake alibi to the detectives, and he stood in front of the national television cameras, demanding the death penalty for the kidnapper. And every single night, after enjoying the media spotlight and the attention of the entire country, he returned to room number 7, poured himself a glass of wine, and went to sleep on the small twin bed, perfectly aware of what was resting, just inches beneath the floorboards. Patrick Henry was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. His trial in 1977 became one of the most publicized and controversial legal battles in French history. The entire country, enraged by the arrogant television interviews, demanded that Patrick face the guillotine. But his defense attorney argued passionately against capital punishment, shifting the entire trial into a national debate on the death penalty itself. The jury ultimately spared Patrick's life, sentencing him to life in prison instead. The sheer magnitude of this trial became a major catalyst for the country. And just 4 years later, France officially abolished the guillotine and the death penalty entirely. But while this young man actively sought out the bright glare of television cameras to hide his crimes in a provincial French town, a completely different type of killer was operating on the other side of the Atlantic. This person did not want an audience at all. They only wanted to be left completely alone on a snowy Midwestern highway, completely unaware that a single strand of hair left in the winter cold would eventually catch up to them nearly 50 years later. On the afternoon of February 15th, 1977, 25-year-old Mary Schley was moving quickly around her small apartment in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She had clothes scattered across her bed and several large canvas bags open on the floor. Mary was an independent artist, and she spent almost all of her free time painting and sketching. Her apartment always smelled heavily of oil, paint, and turpentine, and there were stacks of sketchbooks piled up high on her kitchen table. On this particular Tuesday, she was packing up her best pieces because she was heading down to an art show in Chicago, Illinois. She gathered her brushes, carefully rolled up her canvases, and stuffed them into a thick canvas duffel bag. She did not have a lot of extra money. Most of her income came from picking up odd jobs around the city, so she could afford her art supplies and pay her rent. Because she was on a very tight budget, buying a plane ticket or even a bus ticket to Chicago was completely out of the question. So Mary planned to get there the same way she got everywhere else. She was going to hitchhike. Back in 1977, hitchhiking was just a very common way for young people to get across the country. It was inexpensive, it was widely accepted, and Mary had done it plenty of times before without any issues. She put on a heavy winter coat, grabbed her bags, and walked out the door into the freezing Minnesota winter. The temperature was hovering right around 0 degrees, and the wind was blowing hard off the lakes. She walked a few blocks until she reached the edge of the major highway that connected Minneapolis to the eastbound routes toward Chicago. She dropped her heavy bags in the snow, pulled her collar up around her neck to block the wind, and stuck her thumb out. Cars and trucks sped past her, kicking up salt and dirty snow. She stood out there for almost an hour, shifting her weight from foot to foot to keep her toes from going numb. Finally, a compact car slowed down, pulled over onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of her, and stopped. Mary picked up her bags, ran up to the passenger side, and opened the door. She tossed her bags inside, climbed in, and pulled the heavy door shut. About 3 hours later, a man was driving his pickup truck down a very remote, snowy stretch of road near the small town of Spring Brook in rural western Wisconsin. This area was mostly just dense pine forests and open fields buried under several feet of snow. The man had the heat blasting in his truck and the radio playing quietly. As he rounded a long curve in the road, he noticed a compact car parked awkwardly on the shoulder up ahead. The car's engine was running, and the exhaust pipe was kicking out a thick cloud of white smoke into the freezing air. As the man in the pickup truck got closer, he watched the driver's side door of the compact car open. A man stepped out, walked quickly around the back of the car to the passenger side, and opened the door. The man in the pickup truck took his foot off the gas, assuming this driver had just gotten a flat tire or was having engine trouble. But then he watched as the driver reached into the passenger seat and dragged a large, heavy object out of the car. The driver heaved the object over the snowbank on the side of the road, letting it tumble down into the deep powder. Then the driver immediately turned around, sprinted back to the driver's side door, jumped in, and slammed on the gas. The compact car sped off down the icy road and disappeared around the next bend. The man in the pickup truck pulled over and put his vehicle in park. He stepped out into the cold and walked over to the snowbank where the compact car had just been parked. He looked down over the edge of the piled snow and saw a woman lying face up. She was wearing a heavy winter coat, and the white snow all around her was rapidly turning dark red. It was Mary Schley. The man ran back to his truck, sped to the nearest farmhouse, and called the police. When the local sheriff's deputies arrived at the snowbank, they found Mary dead. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been stabbed 15 times in the chest and back. The crime scene investigators sectioned off the road and began searching the snow for any evidence. But the wind was blowing hard, and the snow was already beginning to cover the tire tracks left by the compact car. They found Mary's canvas bag sitting near her body, completely untouched. Her money and her art supplies were all still inside, so the detectives knew this was not a robbery. As they expanded their search radius, one of the deputies found a single item lying in the snow about 20 feet away from Mary's body. It was a dark knit stocking cap. The cap did not belong to Mary, and it looked like it had been dropped in a hurry. When the crime lab technicians looked closely at the inside of the knit cap, they found several short strands of hair caught in the fabric. For the local detectives in Wisconsin, this stocking cap was basically their only lead. They sent the hairs to the state crime lab, but in 1977, DNA testing did not exist. The lab could only determine the blood type of the person the hair belonged to, which was not enough to identify a specific individual. So, the detectives started interviewing people around Minneapolis who knew Mary. They tracked down other hitchhikers. They looked into local men who drove compact cars. They brought in dozens of suspects for questioning over the next several months, taking statements and checking alibis. But every single person they looked at had a solid alibi, or their blood type did not match the hair inside the cap. Years passed. The original detectives on the case retired, and new detectives took over. They put the stocking cap inside a brown paper evidence bag and placed it in a cardboard box in the basement of the police department. The box sat on a metal shelf for decades, gathering dust as the case went completely cold. In 2009, 32 years after Mary was found in the snow, a cold case detective decided to reopen the file. The detective looked at the old suspect lists from the 70s and noticed a man who had been questioned back then but was never fully cleared. This man had died several years prior, but the detective secured a court order to exhume his body. They brought a medical team out to the local cemetery, dug up the casket, and extracted a DNA sample from the remains. They compared it to the DNA they could now successfully extract from the hairs inside the stocking cap. The results came back negative. it was not a match. The case hit another total dead end, and the evidence box went right back onto the metal shelf. More time passed. Then, in early 2024, a group of investigative genetic genealogists, working with law enforcement, decided to look at the hairs from the stocking cap again. Genetic genealogy is a process where scientists take an unknown DNA sample from a crime scene, map out its specific genetic profile, and then upload that profile into public genealogy databases. These are the exact same databases that regular people use to trace their family trees and find out where their ancestors came from. By finding distant relatives of the suspect, like third or fourth cousins who share small amounts of DNA, the genealogist can build massive family trees. They work backward through census records, birth certificates, and marriage licenses, narrowing down the branches generation by generation until they pinpoint the exact person who matches the crime scene DNA. It is a highly complex process that can take thousands of hours of painstaking research. The genealogist spent months tracing the family tree connected to the short hairs found in the stocking cap. They sifted through thousands of historical records and followed the lineage down through the decades. Finally, in late 2024, 47 years after the crime took place, the genealogist handed a single name to the detectives. The DNA from the stocking cap belonged to a man living quietly in the small town of Owatonna, Minnesota. He was 84 years old. Based on physical evidence, forensic genealogy, and police investigative reports, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Mary Schley on the afternoon of February 15, 1977. The driver of the compact car was cruising down the highway, leaving Minneapolis, when he saw a young woman standing on the snowy shoulder holding a large canvas bag. He slowed his car down, pulled over onto the shoulder, and waited for her to get in. When Mary climbed into the passenger seat, she thanked him for stopping. She told him she was heading to Chicago for an art show and just needed to get as far east as he was willing to take her. The driver nodded, put the car in drive, and merged back onto the highway. They drove for a couple of hours, crossing the state line from Minnesota into Wisconsin. The heater in the car was running, and the windows were fogged up from the extreme cold outside. The driver listened as Mary talked about her painting and her plans for the weekend. But the driver was not really paying attention to her stories. He was gripping the steering wheel and looking for a specific type of road. Eventually, he took an exit off the main highway and turned onto a rural two-lane road that cut directly through the dense pine forests. Mary asked him where they were going, but he just told her he knew a shortcut that would bypass the highway traffic. When they reached an isolated stretch of road near Springbrook, where there were no houses and no other cars in sight, the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly on the ice before coming to a stop on the shoulder. Before Mary could even unbuckle her seatbelt, the driver reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a knife. He lunged across the center console and began stabbing her. Mary put her hands up and tried to fight back, twisting her body to grab the door handle. The driver kept swinging the knife, hitting her in the chest and back. During the violent struggle inside the small car, Mary's hands caught the driver's dark knit stocking cap and pulled it off his head, dropping it onto the floorboard near her feet. The driver grabbed Mary by her winter coat, pushed the passenger door open, and shoved her completely out of the car. Her body tumbled down the steep snowbank and landed in the deep powder. The driver reached over, grabbed her heavy canvas bags, and threw those out into the snow after her. He pulled the passenger door shut, slid back behind the steering wheel, and stomped on the gas pedal. As he sped away down the icy road, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw nothing but empty white fields. He reached up to his head and realized his knit cap was missing, but he was not going to stop and go back for it. He kept driving until he was miles away from the scene. For the next 47 years, this man went about his normal life. He got older, his hair turned gray, and he eventually retired to a quiet, unassuming house in Owatonna, Minnesota. He spent his days sitting in his living room, watching television, mowing his lawn, and living the completely ordinary routine of an elderly man. He knew that the detectives in the 70s had never knocked on his door. He knew that the decades had passed without a single whisper of suspicion falling on him. He was entirely certain that the young artist he had left in the snowbank was a permanently buried secret, and that he would eventually pass away from old age, having gotten away with it completely. Then, on a quiet afternoon in late 2024, the 84-year-old man heard a heavy knock on his front door. When he got up from his chair and slowly walked over to open it, he found a group of law enforcement officers standing on his porch. The man, whose name was John Miller, was immediately placed in handcuffs. The microscopic cells he had left inside his winter hat half a century earlier had finally caught up to him. John Miller was charged with the murder of Mary Schley and taken to jail to await trial, ending a 47-year cold case. While this man hid his secrets in the snowy American Midwest for half a century, completely avoiding the eyes of the law, a very different kind of mystery was unfolding on the other side of the world, where a quiet suburban house remained, perfectly locked, but a child inside simply vanished into the freezing night air. On the night of January 12th, 1976, 8-year-old Eloise Worlage was getting ready for bed in her home in Beaumaris, a suburb of Melbourne, Australia. Beaumaris sat right on the edge of Port Phillip Bay, and the streets were lined with tall native tea trees. You could almost always hear the ocean wind coming off the water. The houses were mostly single-story brick homes with wide front yards and very low fences. Children in the neighborhood frequently played cricket in the middle of the street. They rode their bicycles down to the beach without any supervision, and families very rarely bothered to lock their front doors during the day. But inside the Worlage home on Scott Street, things were incredibly tense. Eloise's parents, Patsy and Lindsay, were in the middle of a very bitter, very drawn-out divorce. And even though they were legally separating, they were still living in the exact same house. So you can imagine the daily atmosphere inside that home. Patsy and Lindsay avoided each other as much as possible, communicating only when absolutely necessary, mostly just coordinating the schedules for their 4 children. They ate their meals at different times and stayed in separate rooms. Eloise was an 8-year-old girl with bright blonde hair and a very quiet, gentle demeanor. She had an older brother and 2 younger siblings, and she spent a lot of her time playing with them in the backyard, or sitting alone in her bedroom drawing pictures on the floor. Her bedroom was located at the front of the house. It was a relatively small room. She had a single bed pushed up against one wall, a wooden dresser, and a window that looked directly out onto the front yard and the street beyond. Like most houses in Australia at the time, the window was fitted with a wire fly screen on the outside to keep the insects out when the glass was open. On the evening of January 12th, the weather had turned unseasonably cold for an Australian summer. The wind was blowing hard off the bay, rattling the tea trees in the front yard. Patsy cooked dinner for the kids in the kitchen. They all sat down and ate, and then Patsy guided the younger children through their evening routines. They took their baths, they put on their pajamas, and they brushed their teeth. Lindsay was in another part of the house, keeping the door shut. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Eloise climbed into her small, single bed. She pulled the heavy blankets up to her chin to keep warm. Patsy came into the room, tucked her in, kissed her goodnight, and turned off the overhead light. Patsy then walked down the hallway, checked on the other 3 children to make sure they were asleep in their own beds, and went back into the main living area. She stayed up for a few more hours watching television and reading a book on the couch. Then around 11 o'clock, Patsy walked to the front of the house. She double-checked that the heavy wooden front door was completely shut and locked. She turned off the porch light, casting the front yard into total darkness, and then she went to her own bedroom and went to sleep. The house was completely quiet. The next morning, January 13th, Patsy woke up around 7 o'clock. She got out of bed, put on her robe, and walked out into the main hallway to start getting the kids ready for school. But as soon as she stepped into the hallway, she stopped. The heavy wooden front door, the one she had explicitly checked and locked the night before, was standing wide open. The cold morning air was blowing directly into the house, and the sunlight was spilling across the hallway floorboards. Patsy was confused. She figured that maybe her oldest son had woken up early and gone outside to get the newspaper or to play in the front yard. So she walked over to the open door and looked outside. The front yard was completely empty. The street was quiet. There was no sign of her son. Patsy pulled the heavy door shut, locked it again, and walked down the hallway toward the children's bedrooms. She opened the door to her oldest son's room and saw that he was still fast asleep in his bed. Now a knot of worry began to form in Patsy's stomach. She turned around and walked over to Eloise's bedroom. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was perfectly still, but Eloise's bed was completely empty. The sheets and blankets were pulled back carelessly, hanging off the side of the mattress. Patsy looked around the room. Eloise's clothes from the day before were still neatly folded on the chair. Her shoes were still sitting on the floor near the dresser. Patsy walked over to the bed and looked out the window. The glass panes were pushed open to let the air in, which was how they always left them during the summer months. But when Patsy looked closer at the wire fly screen covering the outside of the window, she noticed something was wrong. The wire mesh had been sliced right down the middle. It was a perfectly straight vertical cut, starting near the top of the wooden frame and running all the way down to the bottom sill. The cut was so clean and so precise that the two halves of the wire mesh were just resting against each other, barely separated. Patsy immediately began calling out Eloise's name. She ran out of the bedroom and started checking the closets. She looked under the beds. She ran into the backyard and checked behind the bushes and the garden shed. She woke up Lindsay, and the two of them searched every single corner of the property. They ran out into the street, knocking on the neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen an 8-year-old girl in her pajamas. But nobody had seen anything. Eloise was just gone. Patsy ran back inside and picked up the phone. Within 30 minutes, dozens of officers from the Victoria Police Department descended on Scott Street. They set up barricades at both ends of the road. They strung up tape around the Whirlage property, and they brought in a team of forensic technicians to examine the house. The detectives knew that the first 48 hours of a child abduction case are the most critical, so they moved incredibly fast. The forensic team started their work in Eloise's bedroom. They dusted the wooden window frame, the glass panes, and the sill for fingerprints. They used special vacuums to collect any microscopic fibers or hairs from the carpet and the bed sheets. Then they went outside and examined the sliced fly screen. The cut was incredibly sharp, indicating that whoever did this used a razor blade or a very sharp utility knife. The detectives assumed that an intruder had walked up to the house in the middle of the night, cut the screen, reached their hand through the slit to unlatch the window, and climbed inside to take the girl. But as the forensic technicians looked down at the ground directly beneath the window, they realized this theory had a massive problem. Directly below Eloise's window was a garden bed filled with very soft, loose soil. If a grown man had stood outside that window to slice the screen and then hoisted himself up to climb through the frame, he would have trampled the soil. He would have left deep, distinct boot prints in the dirt. And he would have left scuff marks on the brick wall directly below the sill as he kicked his legs up to climb inside. But there were no footprints in the soft soil. There was not a single disturbance in the dirt. The flower bed was completely pristine. There were no scuff marks on the brick wall. And when the fingerprint results came back, the technicians confirmed there were no foreign fingerprints anywhere near the window, the frame, or the glass. There was absolutely no physical evidence that anyone had entered the house through that window. While the forensic team was processing the house, dozens of other officers began knocking on doors, conducting a massive neighborhood canvass. They spoke to every single person living within a 1-mile radius of the Whirlage home. They asked about suspicious vehicles, strange noises, or anyone acting out of the ordinary. And during this canvass, they spoke to a woman who lived in the house right next door to the Whirlages. Her bedroom window faced the side of the Whirlage property. This neighbor told the detectives that she had been sleeping in her bed the night before, but she had woken up very suddenly around 2 in the morning. She said she lay there in the dark listening, and then she heard a voice coming from the direction of the street or the front yard. It was the voice of a young child. The neighbor said the child called out into the darkness saying, "Let me go." Mr. X. The neighbor explained that the child sounded distressed, but she did not scream. The neighbor assumed it was just one of the kids on the street, having a bad dream or crying out in their sleep. She listened for a few more minutes, and when she didn't hear anything else, she just rolled over and went back to sleep. The detectives documented this statement immediately. The neighbor's account was huge. It established a timeline suggesting Eloise was taken from the house right around 2 in the morning. But more importantly, it established something crucial about the abductor. The child said, "Let me go, Mr. X." She used a title of respect. She did not scream bloody murder like a child being snatched by a complete stranger in the dark. The phrasing strongly suggested that Eloise recognized the person who was taking her away. By the next morning, the disappearance of Eloise Worlage was the lead story on every news broadcast and the front page of every newspaper in the country. The Victoria Police launched the largest and most extensive search operation in the state's history. They brought in hundreds of uniformed police officers and thousands of civilian volunteers. They formed massive search lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through the thick tea tree, scrublands, the local golf courses, and the public parks. Because Beaumaris was a coastal town, the police deployed helicopters to fly low over Port Phillip Bay, scanning the water for any signs of a body. They brought in specialized police divers wearing thick wetsuits to search the murky waters near the shoreline. The divers spent days plunging into the freezing water, feeling blindly through the thick kelp forests and searching the rocky crevices at the base of the coastal cliffs. They dragged the bottom of the bay with heavy nets, but they found absolutely nothing. The detectives working the case were drowning in tips from the public. They followed up on over 10,000 separate pieces of information. They tracked down every single registered sex offender in the region, bringing them in for intense questioning and verifying their alibis for the night of January 12th. At one point, a witness came forward and reported seeing a dark green car speeding down a street just a few blocks away from the Worlage home in the middle of the night. The witness said the car had its headlights turned completely off, which was highly suspicious. The detectives spent weeks tracking down the registry of every dark green car matching that description in the entire state of Victoria. They finally located, the driver brought him in, and interrogated him for hours. But the man was able to prove that he was just a local resident driving home late from a shift, and he had simply forgotten to turn his headlights on. He was completely cleared. The police also looked heavily into a series of prowler reports in the Beaumaris area. Over the previous few months, several residents had called the police to report seeing unknown men walking down the streets late at night or peering into windows. The detectives tracked down every single individual who had been stopped for loitering or prowling in the area. They cross-referenced their schedules. They checked their alibis, and they found that not a single one of them could be tied to the Worlage house on the night of the disappearance. Every single lead they chased turned into a massive dead end. Months passed, and the case began to grow cold. The investigators were incredibly frustrated. They kept returning to the physical evidence at the house on Scott Street. They laid out all the facts on a whiteboard in the precinct. A stranger breaking into a locked house in the middle of the night would invariably leave some kind of physical trace. They would leave a footprint in the mud, a fiber caught on a door hinge, a smudge on a piece of glass, or a tool mark on a lock. But the Worlage home was completely devoid of foreign evidence. Furthermore, the layout of the house was completely dark. A stranger wandering in from the street would not know exactly which bedroom belonged to the 8-year-old girl, and they would not be able to navigate the hallway without bumping into furniture or making a noise that would wake up the parents sleeping just a few rooms away. And then there was the fly screen on the window. The forensic team conducted extensive experiments on identical wire screens back at the laboratory. They took various razor blades and utility knives and tried to replicate the exact cut found on Eloise's window. They discovered that the wire mesh was incredibly tough to make a cut that straight, that long, and that precise from the outside of the house, a person would have to be standing firmly on the ground, applying a significant amount of forward pressure with both hands. But the detectives already knew that no one had stood on the soft soil outside the window. The flower bed was perfectly pristine. This led the investigators to a startling conclusion. The screen was not cut by someone trying to get into the house. It was cut by someone who was already inside the house, or it was cut very carefully by someone leaning out the window from the inside, deliberately trying to stage a break-in to throw the police off the trail. And when they combined this conclusion with the neighbor's testimony, the fact that Eloise called the person Mr. X, indicating familiarity, the detectives realized they were likely not looking for a stranger wandering the streets. They were looking for someone who had intimate access to the house, someone who knew the layout in the dark, and someone Eloise trusted enough to follow out of bed without screaming. With all the outside suspects entirely cleared, the police turned their intense focus onto the people who were already inside the house on the night of January 12th. Specifically, they focused heavily on Eloise's father, Lindsay. The detectives knew that the divorce between Lindsay and Patsy was highly contentious. They theorized that Lindsay might have taken Eloise and hidden her away somewhere to spite Patsy, or to gain some kind of cruel leverage in their ongoing custody battle. The police brought Lindsay in for questioning multiple times. They interrogated him for hours, pressing him on his movements that night, his relationship with Patsy, and his financial records. They accused him of staging the window screen and walking his daughter right out the front door. But Lindsay vehemently denied having anything to do with Eloise's disappearance. He stuck rigidly to his story, that he was asleep in his bed in another part of the house the entire night. Despite the intense public scrutiny and the relentless pressure from the detectives, his alibi could not be definitively broken. There was no physical evidence tying him or anyone else to the crime. Based on the forensic analysis of the scene, police reports and witness statements, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened on the cold night of January 12, 1976. Around 2 a.m, a figure walked quietly down the dark hallway of the Worlge home. They did not have to pick a lock, they did not have to break any glass, and they did not have to force a door, because they were already inside the house. They knew exactly where they were going. They stepped quietly into Eloise's bedroom. The room was pitch black. They walked over to the single bed, gently woke the 8-year-old girl up and told her to get out of bed and come with them. Because Eloise recognized this person and trusted them, she did not scream. She simply rubbed her eyes, got out of bed, and stood on the floor in her pajamas. The figure then walked over to the open window. They pulled out a sharp utility blade, reached their hand carefully toward the wire fly screen, and sliced the mesh perfectly straight down the middle. They made sure not to push outward too hard, ensuring that no debris or pressure disturbed the soft soil in the flower bed outside. They were meticulously staging a crime scene, creating a false narrative of an outside intruder to confuse the police investigation that they knew would begin in a few hours. Once the screen was cut, the figure turned back around, took Eloise by the hand, and led her quietly out of the bedroom. They walked down the main hallway toward the front of the house. They reached out, unlocked the heavy wooden front door, and pulled it open. The cold night air rushed into the hallway. The figure led Eloise out onto the front porch, down the walkway, and out toward the dark street, leaving the heavy wooden door standing wide open behind them. As they walked away from the safety of the house and into the darkness, Eloise suddenly realized that something was very wrong. This was not a normal nighttime walk. She grew frightened and tried to pull her hand away. As the figure tightened their grip, Eloise called out into the quiet suburban street, crying, "Let me go," and addressing the person by a name she knew. But the figure did not let her go. They pulled her away into the freezing night, taking her to a location that has never been discovered, and leaving absolutely no physical trace behind. Despite launching the largest and most expensive search operation in the history of the state, Eloise Worlge was never found. Lindsay Worlge was never officially charged with any crime related to his daughter's disappearance. He maintained his complete innocence until he passed away years later. To this day, the case remains one of Australia's most enduring unsolved mysteries. A cold file sitting in a police archive, filled with thousands of pages of dead ends, leaving behind only the image of an open front door and a perfectly sliced window screen. But while this individual managed to slip out of a quiet suburban home and vanish completely into the dark, without leaving a single footprint or fiber behind, Another tragedy was unfolding on a much larger, much more catastrophic scale. This next event did not involve a quiet, silent disappearance in the dead of night, but rather a sudden, deafening mechanical failure high in the freezing air, where a crowded cabin full of people was suddenly and violently dropped from the sky. On the late afternoon of March 9th, 1976, the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Italian Dolomites. The air temperature was dropping rapidly as the evening approached, and a stiff, biting wind was picking up, blowing loose powder across the steep, icy slopes of Mount Cermis and rattling the wooden signs near the ski lifts. 14-year-old Alessandra Piavesana stood near the edge of a groomed ski run, leaning heavily on her metal poles. She lived in Milan and had traveled up into the mountains with a group of friends for a long winter holiday. Her legs were completely exhausted from a full day of navigating the challenging runs, and she was more than ready to get back down to the warm lodge. She reached up with her thick, waterproof gloves and pulled her tinted goggles down around her neck. The skin around her eyes was red and chapped from the freezing wind and the harsh glare of the afternoon snow. She stomped her heavy plastic ski boots against the hard-packed ice a few times to knock the snow loose from the bindings before reaching down to unclip her skis. Just a few dozen yards away sat the upper terminal of the Mount Cermis aerial tramway. It was a massive, brutalist concrete structure built directly onto the edge of a sheer mountain drop. Heavy steel cables that were thicker than a person's arm stretched out from the terminal's mechanical bays and disappeared down into the shadowy, heavily forested valley sitting far below. Alessandra hoisted her heavy skis over her shoulder and walked awkwardly toward the concrete building, her boots clicking loudly on the frozen ground. Dozens of other skiers were doing the exact same thing all around her. It was nearly 5 in the evening, the lifts were closing, and everyone was trying to catch the very last cable car down to the valley town of Cavalese. The line inside the concrete terminal was long and incredibly noisy. People were shivering in their wet wool sweaters, complaining about stiff joints and cold toes. The air inside the building smelled strongly of damp winter clothes, stale cigarette smoke, and the heavy industrial grease that was used to constantly lubricate the massive metal gears of the tramway system. A loud mechanical clanking echoed through the station, followed quickly by the deep hum of massive electric motors. A heavy yellow and red metal cabin slid smoothly into the docking bay. The heavy doors slid open and the station attendant began waving people inside. The crowd of passengers shuffled forward eagerly, wanting nothing more than to get off the freezing mountain. Alessandra stepped into the cabin, wedging herself between a group of tall adults and a large family carrying extra gear. The space was officially designed to hold 40 people, but the attendant kept pushing more passengers inside to completely clear out the waiting room. Eventually, 44 people were crammed shoulder to shoulder inside the 3-ton metal box. There was absolutely no room to move your arms or shift your weight. Skis and metal poles clattered against each other as the crowd settled in. People were pressed tight, their wet winter coats rubbing together. The large glass windows quickly fogged up from the collective breath of over 4 dozen people. Alessandra stood near the center, holding tightly to a metal handrail. The attendant standing on the concrete platform pulled the heavy metal doors shut and threw the locking latch into place. The electric motors inside the station hummed louder, and the cabin suddenly lurched forward. It slid out of the concrete bay and swung directly out over the sheer precipice. The solid ground dropped away instantly, leaving them suspended high in the air. The cabin swayed back and forth on its carriage as it began the long descent. The wind was blowing hard against the flat metal sides of the car, causing it to rock heavily. The passengers went entirely quiet, listening only to the whistling wind and the constant rhythmic scraping of the metal carriage rolling along the heavy steel support cable directly above their heads. About a mile down the mountain, the cable car approached a massive steel support pylon. These tall structural towers held the heavy cables high above the uneven terrain. As the cabin passed over the top of the tower, the wind hit it with a sudden, violent gust. The 3-ton box swung wildly to the side, tilting the metal floor at a sharp angle and throwing people off balance. A deafening metallic grinding noise erupted from the roof of the cabin. It sounded like a massive piece of steel was being pushed forcefully through an industrial shredder. A shower of bright metallic sparks rained down past the foggy glass windows, and then there was a sound exactly like a cannon, firing a sharp echoing crack that vibrated violently through the floor. The cabin completely stopped moving forward. For a split second, it just hung motionless in the freezing air, suspended by absolutely nothing. And then the floor completely dropped out from under the passengers. The 3-ton metal box began a total freefall, plunging straight down toward the rocky, snow-covered mountain meadow located 660 feet below them. Down in the valley town of Cavalice, local residents were walking along the cobblestone streets when they heard the massive crack echo off the surrounding mountain walls. A worker standing outside the lower tramway station looked up at the sky and saw the thick steel support cable suddenly whip backward and go completely slack, dropping heavily into the dense pine trees. The operator sitting inside the station slammed his hand onto the emergency stop button, but the dials on his main control panel had already flatlined. The tension in the main line was entirely gone. He grabbed a two-way radio from the desk and started shouting up to the upper terminal, asking what had just happened to the lines. There was no response, but radio static. Within 20 minutes, the local fire brigade and alpine rescue teams were fully mobilized. They loaded their heavy gear into specialized off-road vehicles and began driving up the narrow logging roads toward the middle section of the mountain. The sun had fully set by this point, and the temperature was well below zero. They drove in total darkness, scanning the tree line. The rescue teams eventually reached a point where their vehicles could no longer climb the steep, icy terrain. They piled out and began hiking up the mountain on foot using high-powered flashlights to cut through the dense pine trees. They were looking for the metal cabin, hoping it had somehow snagged on the lower cables or caught securely in the heavy timber above the ground. After an hour of hard hiking, the lead searcher broke through the tree line and stepped into an open, sloping meadow covered in deep snow. His flashlight beam swept across the white landscape and hit a massive jagged crater dug deep into the frozen earth. The snow all around the large crater was heavily churned up and stained with large patches of dark red. Resting at the absolute bottom of the crater was a twisted, mangled pile of yellow and red steel. The 3-ton cabin had hit the ground with such extreme force that it had completely flattened, crushing violently inward on itself. It had then skidded down the icy meadow for another 300 feet, before finally plowing into the dirt and coming to a complete stop. The rescuers ran toward the wreckage, their heavy boots sinking deep into the mountain snow. As they got closer, they shined their lights straight into the gaps of the crushed steel. The scene was a chaotic mess of twisted metal. Broken skis, plastic boots, and torn winter clothing were scattered across hundreds of yards. The metal frame of the cabin was totally unrecognizable. The team began the agonizing process of trying to pry the heavy steel plates apart, using iron crowbars and hydraulic tools. They were looking for any sign of movement, but they knew the physical reality of the situation. The loaded cabin had fallen over 60 stories straight out of the sky. No human body was meant to withstand that kind of sudden, blunt force impact. As they pulled the jagged metal away, piece by piece, they began finding the passengers. They found men, women, and teenagers mixed in with the wreckage. They found 15 young children who had simply been riding down to the valley for dinner. The medical personnel on the scene moved quickly, from person to person, checking for pulses, but they were just shaking their heads. The winter wind continued to blow hard across the open meadow, making it incredibly difficult to hear anything over the loud mechanical drone of the portable generators powering the floodlights. But as a rescuer was pulling a piece of the aluminum siding away from the direct center of the crushed cabin, he stopped moving. He raised his hand and yelled for everyone to cut the engines. The generators were instantly killed, plunging the dark mountain meadow into absolute silence. The rescuer leaned his head down near a small triangular gap in the crushed metal floorboards. He held his breath and listened closely. From deep inside the tangled pile of steel and snow, he heard a faint, shallow intake of air. Someone inside the wreckage was still breathing. The entire team rushed over to the spot and began frantically digging with their bare hands, throwing chunks of sharp metal and ice out of the way. They tunneled down into the wreckage until their hands brushed against a thick winter coat. They pulled the surrounding debris back and found a teenage girl. Her eyes were closed shut, but her chest was slowly rising and falling. It was Alessandra Piovesana. She had been standing near the exact center of the cabin when it fell, and the bodies of the other passengers clustered around her had somehow cushioned her from the direct force of the impact. The rescuers carefully strapped her to a rigid backboard, carried her down the mountain in the freezing dark, and rushed her to a waiting ambulance. Based on extensive metallurgical testing, detailed mechanical engineering reports, and official government investigations spanning several months, here is a complete reconstruction of exactly what caused the Mount Cermis aerial tramway to fail and fall from the sky on the freezing evening of March 9th, 1976. The tramway system operated using two distinct steel cables. There was a thick stationary support cable that bore the entire 3-ton weight of the passenger cabin. And there was a much thinner moving haulage cable that acted exactly like a tow rope, pulling the cabin up the mountain and lowering it down. The two cables were mechanically designed to stay completely separate. But on that specific afternoon, the high winds blowing across the open valley caused the cabin to swing laterally back and forth as it approached the massive steel support pylon. Because the cabin was overloaded with 44 people, the weight distribution was thrown off, causing the carriage to tilt awkwardly as the metal wheels rolled over the mechanical guides on the tower. The extreme swinging motion caused the moving haulage cable to completely jump out of its designated track on the steel pylon. It snapped violently sideways and landed directly on top of the stationary weight-bearing support cable. The operator down in the valley had absolutely no idea this had happened, so the large electric engines kept running, pulling the haulage cable downward. The moving steel rope acted exactly like an industrial bandsaw, aggressively grinding against the thick support cable. With the massive weight of the loaded cabin pulling down, the friction was immense. It only took a matter of seconds for the moving cable to completely slice through the 3 inches of braided steel that was holding the crowded cabin high up in the freezing air. The investigation into the disaster revealed that the safety mechanisms designed to stop the tramway in the event of crossed cables had actually been manually overridden. The operators had been struggling with the system stopping unnecessarily during high winds, so they had altered the safety circuits to keep the cars running on schedule, completely removing the only active failsafe. 43 people died instantly on the snow-covered slopes of Mount Cermis that day. The disaster remains the deadliest cable car accident in world history. Alessandra Piovesana was the sole survivor. She spent months in a hospital recovering from severe internal injuries and multiple broken bones, carrying the physical scars of the fall for the rest of her natural life. But while this catastrophic mechanical failure brought sudden, unpredictable death falling from the sky without warning, a completely different kind of tragedy was unfolding in a quiet town in Germany. This next event did not involve a sudden drop or a broken cable, but rather a slow, deliberate starvation driven entirely by a family's absolute belief in the supernatural. In September of 1968, a 16-year-old girl named Anneliese Michel sat at the heavy dining table in her family home in Klingenberg, West Germany. She had her school books spread out across the polished wood, trying to finish her homework. Her mother, Anna, was in the kitchen preparing a stew. The smell of boiled potatoes filled the small house, and the only sound was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. Anneliese lived a very quiet and structured life. Her family was extremely strict and deeply religious, attending Catholic Mass at least twice a week. She did not go out to parties with other teenagers. Instead, she spent almost all of her free time reading in her room, playing the piano, or kneeling on the hard wooden floor by her bed to pray. She was known around the neighborhood as a polite, obedient daughter who never caused any trouble. On this particular evening, Annalise finished her schoolwork and carried her books upstairs. She placed them neatly on her small wooden desk and sat on the edge of her bed. But as she reached down to untie her shoes, a heavy feeling washed over her. Her hands began to tremble. She tried to stand up, but her throat tightened and she could not make a sound. Her body went completely rigid and she pitched forward, collapsing onto the floorboards. She lay there in the quiet room, completely paralyzed. A few minutes later, her father, Josef, walked up the stairs to tell her dinner was ready. He pushed her bedroom door open and found his daughter lying on the floor. Her eyes rolled back. He shouted for his wife, and together they carried Annalise to the bed, waiting for the local doctor. The doctor examined her thoroughly, checking her reflexes and listening to her heart, but he could not find anything physically wrong. He told Joseph and Anna that it was likely just exhaustion and advised them to let her rest. For a while, things returned to normal, but almost exactly a year later, she experienced another episode in the middle of the night. She woke up feeling an immense pressure on her chest, as if a heavy weight was pinning her to the mattress. She tried to sit up, but her arms and legs refused to move. Then she wet the bed, totally unable to control her own body. When the paralysis finally broke, she was exhausted and deeply ashamed. Her parents took her to a neurologist at a nearby clinic. After running tests, the specialist diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy. But the anticonvulsant pills did not seem to help. In fact, her condition slowly began to deteriorate over the next few years. She managed to finish high school and enroll in a local college to become a teacher, but her daily life became a massive struggle. She started complaining that the medication was making her feel completely numb and isolated. She spent most of her time inside her dorm room, pulling away from the friends she had made. She tried to push through the intense brain fog by spending extra hours in the college library, reading her textbooks until her vision blurred. She would call her mother from a payphone in the hallway, crying softly into the receiver, explaining that she felt a dark, heavy shadow constantly following her around. Anna would just tell her to pray harder and to read her Bible. But the shadow never left pressing down on her heavy shoulders. By 1973, her symptoms had escalated far beyond simple physical seizures. She returned to her parents' house in Klingenberg, unable to continue her studies. One afternoon, while sitting in the living room, Annalise suddenly covered her face with her hands and began to cry. When her mother asked what was wrong, the young woman whispered that she was seeing terrible things. She said the faces around her were changing into monsters. Anna thought her daughter was just having a bad reaction to a new prescription. She brought Annalise a glass of water and told her to go lie down, but the hallucinations only grew worse. Annalise began to complain about a stench in the house, a smell like burning garbage, but nobody else could smell a thing. She also started hearing voices in her head. The family's neighbors began to notice that something was terribly wrong. People walking past the Michel house would sometimes hear sudden, violent crashes coming from the living room, followed by agonizing wails. When a local baker asked Joseph about the noises over the garden fence one morning, Joseph quickly looked down at his shoes. He lied and said they were doing heavy renovations inside, and he quickly changed the subject to the weather. Her parents took her back to several different doctors and psychiatrists. She was given more medications, this time antipsychotics, to treat what the doctors now believed was severe depression and epileptic psychosis. But Annalise refused to take the pills. She told her parents that the doctors did not understand what was actually happening to her. She believed the medical treatments were useless because it was not a medical problem at all. The neurologists at the clinic were incredibly frustrated by the family's reluctance. They insisted that Annalise needed to be admitted for a long-term psychiatric evaluation. One of the doctors warned Joseph that if she did not take the medication, her brain would become entirely overwhelmed. But Joseph argued that the doctors simply did not possess the spiritual tools required to fix his daughter. He drove Annalise right back home. Her behavior in the house became increasingly erratic. She completely stopped sleeping in her bed, choosing instead to lie on the bare, freezing floor of her bedroom. She would stay awake for days at a time, pacing back and forth across the wooden floorboards, muttering under her breath. Joseph and Anna would listen from down the hall, unsure of what their daughter might do next. They hid the kitchen knives and locked the front door every night. Things reached a breaking point during the summer of 1975. Annalise stopped eating the meals her mother prepared. She claimed that unseen forces were physically preventing her from swallowing normal food. Instead, her parents would find her in the corners of the house eating spiders and flies she caught off the walls. She began drinking her own urine straight from the floor, and she would bark like a dog until her throat bled. Her younger sisters would avoid her at all costs. They would lock themselves inside their shared bedroom at the end of the hall, putting a heavy wooden chair against the doorknob. They could hear Annalise dragging her body across the floorboards outside their door. She would whisper their names through the crack beneath the door, in an unnatural register. She also became extremely aggressive. If anyone tried to approach her, she would lash out, kicking and scratching wildly. She destroyed the crucifixes hanging on the walls and tore the heads off the small wooden rosaries her mother kept on the nightstands. For a deeply devout family like the Michels, this specific hatred of religious objects was a massive turning point. They abandoned modern medicine entirely and turned to their local church. Joseph and Anna approached several pastors, pleading for an official intervention. They explained their daughter's aversion to sacred objects, the rotting smells, and the deep voices. The local clergy were initially very hesitant. They advised the parents to continue with psychiatric care, noting that strict religious rites were rarely approved by the modern church. But the family refused to go back to the hospital, pushing for an alternative. Finally, in September of 1975, a bishop secretly granted permission for a specific ancient ritual to be performed. 2 local men from the church were assigned to the house. They arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, carrying a small leather bag containing a wooden cross, holy water, and a worn ritual book. When they walked into the living room, Annalise was sitting on the floor in the corner, glaring at them from the shadows. Over the next 10 months, these 2 men visited the house in Klingenberg constantly. They conducted 67 separate sessions, often lasting up to 4 hours apiece. During these sessions, the living room furniture was pushed to the walls. Annalise would be held down on the floor by her parents, or bound to a chair. She would thrash violently, screaming insults, while the men stood over her, reading loudly and splashing water on her face. The physical toll on the young woman was absolute. Because she was constantly restrained and engaged in hours of screaming and fighting, her body was burning through massive amounts of energy. But she was still refusing to eat. She believed that starvation was the only way to weaken the grip of the unseen forces inside her. Her parents and the 2 men completely supported this logic. They watched her waste away, believing it was a sacrifice. By the spring of 1976, Annalise was completely unrecognizable. She had lost nearly all her hair, and her skin was stretched tight over her bones. Her knees were fractured from being forced to kneel on the hard floor for countless hours, making it impossible for her to walk without assistance. She contracted pneumonia, and she was running a high fever. But despite her physical condition, no one ever called for an ambulance. They kept the curtains drawn tight, hiding her from the neighbors and the outside world. The 2 men continued to visit twice a week, reading their texts over her frail, bedridden body. Whenever her voice grew weak and she stopped fighting back, they took it as a sign of success. They told the parents that the ordeal was almost over, and so Joseph and Anna simply sat by her bedside, holding her bruised hands and waiting for the final breakthrough. On the evening of June 30th, 1976, Annalise lay in her bed, struggling to take a single breath. The pneumonia had completely filled her lungs. She turned her head weakly toward her mother and whispered that she was afraid. Anna stroked her daughter's forehead and told her to just go to sleep. The 2 men packed up their bags, told the parents they would return in a few days, and walked out the heavy front door. The next morning, Josef walked into the bedroom to check on his daughter. She was lying in the exact same position they had left her in the night before. Her eyes were partially open, staring blankly at the far wall. Her chest was completely still. He touched her arm, finding her skin entirely cold. He told his wife that their daughter was gone. When the authorities were finally notified and arrived at the house, they were completely stunned by what they found in the bedroom. Based on the physical evidence at the scene, the autopsy reports and the subsequent massive legal investigation here is a reconstruction of the true cause behind the death of the young woman in Klingenberg. The people responsible were not shadowy intruders, nor were they unseen supernatural forces. Anneliese was simply a young woman suffering from severe untreated temporal lobe epilepsy and a massive psychotic break. The hallucinations, the aversion to objects, and the strange voices were all documented medical symptoms of her specific psychiatric condition. But her deeply religious parents, Joseph and Anna, along with Father Arnold Renz and Pastor Ernst Alt, chose to completely ignore the reality of medical science to project their own beliefs. Over the course of 10 months, these 4 adults locked a severely mentally ill girl inside her own home and subjected her to intense physical and psychological abuse under the guise of a ritual. Whenever Anneliese begged for help or showed signs of extreme physical failure, they ignored it. They convinced themselves that the starvation and the broken bones were a necessary part of the cure. They watched her slowly die and did absolutely nothing. When the medical examiner weighed her body, Anneliese was 23 years old and weighed exactly 68 pounds. She had died entirely from extreme malnutrition and severe dehydration. The autopsy confirmed that there was no supernatural cause, no unexplainable phenomenon. Her death was a slow process that could have been completely prevented with a simple trip to a hospital and a standard feeding tube, but her caretakers refused to provide it. The state of West Germany immediately stepped in and charged all 4 adults. The ensuing trial in 1978 became a massive national news story. The court listened to hours of audio tapes recorded inside the house, but the judge remained entirely unmoved by the defense's claims of unseen forces. The court declared that Anneliese was clearly mentally ill and that the adults had horribly failed their most basic duty of care to the young woman. Joseph and Anna Michel, along with Father Arnold Renz and Pastor Ernst Alt, were all found guilty of negligent homicide. They were sentenced to 6 months in jail, which was later suspended to 3 years of probation. The case fundamentally changed how such requests were handled, ensuring that psychiatric clearance became a strict requirement, leaving the quiet house in Klingenberg as a grim reminder of blind faith overriding modern medical science. But while a group of trusted adults allowed a sick young woman to slowly waste away inside an ordinary suburban house, completely ignoring the reality right in front of them, a very different kind of reality was descending from the sky in another part of the world. This next event did not involve a prolonged illness behind closed doors, but rather a sudden, bizarre encounter in an open field, leaving behind physical evidence that could not be easily explained away. Late afternoon on Sunday, February 23, 1975. The city of Kofu is nestled deep in a valley in the Yamanashi Prefecture of Japan, completely surrounded by tall, snow-capped mountains. The air in February is bitter and dry, and the wind blows hard off the peaks. In the eastern part of the city sits the Hinode housing estate. It is a working-class neighborhood made up of uniform, 2-story concrete apartment buildings. Between the buildings are small paved parking areas and narrow dirt alleys where residents leave their bicycles. Directly behind the housing estate is a sprawling, privately owned grape vineyard. During the summer months, the vineyard is a lush sea of green leaves and heavy fruit, but in the dead of winter, it is a barren, brown field. It is filled with thick concrete posts and rows of twisted, dormant vines that are strung up tightly on heavy metal wires. The soil is hard and covered in a thick layer of white frost that crunches loudly under your shoes. 7-year-old Masato Kawano and his best friend Katsuhiro Yamahata are playing in the paved lot between 2 of the apartment buildings. They are wearing heavy winter coats, thick wool scarves, and adjustable metal roller skates that strap directly over their regular sneakers. They spend hours skating in circles, racing each other, and scraping their knees on the rough asphalt. The metal wheels make a loud clanking noise that echoes sharply off the concrete walls of the buildings. As the afternoon wears on, the sun begins to set behind the mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the pavement. The temperature drops rapidly, and the boys can clearly see their own breath in the freezing air. The automatic streetlights along the road flicker and hum to life, casting a pale yellow glow over the neighborhood. Up on the second floor of one of the apartment buildings, Masato's mother is standing in her small kitchen. She has the television on in the living room playing a Sunday evening variety show. She is wearing an apron over her sweater and is standing at the counter, carefully slicing daikon radish and carrots for a pot of hot soup. The windows in the kitchen are fogged up from the heat of the stove, and the apartment smells strongly of soy sauce and boiling broth. She glances up at the clock on the wall. It is just past 6:30 in the evening. She knows the streetlights have come on, which is the universal rule for the kids in the neighborhood to come inside for dinner. She expects to hear the front door slide open at any moment. Down in the parking lot, Masato and Katsuhiro are sitting on a low brick wall, using a small metal key to loosen the heavy clamps on their roller skates. They are tired and hungry, and their fingers are stiff from the cold. But as Masato reaches down to pull his left skate off, he hears a low, vibrating noise coming from above. It does not sound like a normal airplane engine. It is a deep, continuous hum, almost like a massive electrical transformer. Masato stops what he is doing and looks up into the darkening sky. He taps Katsuhiro on the arm and points upward. High above the housing estate, the boys see two glowing bright orange objects. They are perfectly round and are moving completely in tandem, gliding silently across the sky. At first, the boys assume they must be airplanes, but they notice there are no blinking red or green navigation lights. There is just a solid burning orange glow, exactly like the heated coils of a toaster oven. As the boys watch in total silence, the two glowing orbs suddenly stop moving forward. They hover in place for a few seconds. Then one of the orange objects shoots off toward Mount Otago and disappears instantly into the heavy clouds. But the second object does not leave. Instead, it begins to slowly descend directly toward the housing estate. It drops lower and lower, crossing directly over the roof of the adjacent concrete apartment block. The object is so large and so intensely bright that it briefly illuminates the entire parking lot in a harsh orange light. The boys sit frozen on the brick wall as the glowing object glides silently past the buildings and drops down into the dark, barren vineyard directly behind the estate. The humming noise completely stops. The neighborhood goes completely quiet again. Masato and Katsuhiro quickly unstrap their metal skates, drop them on the asphalt, and run around the side of the apartment building to get a look at the vineyard. The field is pitch black, but they can see a faint silvery reflection glowing through the rows of bare grapevines. They step off the pavement and walk into the dirt field. The ground is highly uneven, frozen solid, and covered in dead leaves that crunch loudly under their sneakers. They carefully navigate through the thick concrete posts and the low-hanging metal wires, moving deeper into the vineyard toward the source of the glow. After walking a few dozen yards, they push past a row of twisted vines and stop dead in their tracks. Sitting right there in a small clearing in the dirt is a massive, solid object. It is no longer glowing orange. It is a large disc-shaped craft, approximately 15 feet in diameter and 7 feet tall, with a flattened dome-like structure on top. The exterior is made of a seamless, shiny silver metal that reflects the faint ambient light from the distant street lamps. The boys can see strange raised characters resembling a blocky, unknown alphabet, etched deeply into the side of the metal hull. The entire craft is resting heavily on 3 thick spherical landing gears that are pressed deep into the frozen soil. The air around the object feels unusually warm, and there is a distinct smell in the air, something exactly like burning ozone or hot metal. The boys do not make a sound. They duck down and hide behind one of the thick concrete trellis pillars, peering around the rough edge. Suddenly, a section of the silver hull slides open with a sharp pneumatic hiss. A metal ramp extends outward and drops down to the dirt. A few seconds later, a figure walks slowly down the ramp and steps into the vineyard. The entity is small, only about 4 feet tall. It is wearing a seamless silver uniform that covers its torso and legs. But it is the creature's head that the boys focus on. It has no hair whatsoever. The skin on its head and face is dark brown and covered in deep, heavy, parallel wrinkles resembling the rough bark of an old tree. The wrinkles are so dense that the boys cannot see any eyes or a nose. The only visible feature on its face is a mouth, which contains 3 large silvery fangs protruding outward. It has long, pointed ears that stick out from the sides of its head, and its arms are disproportionately long, hanging all the way down past its knees. In one of its hands, the creature is holding a long metallic tube that resembles a rifle with a bulbous end. The entity walks slowly around the base of the craft, examining the spherical landing gear and looking down at the dirt. Then, it completely stops moving. It slowly turns its deeply wrinkled head and looks directly at the concrete pillar where the boys are hiding. It knows exactly where they are. The creature begins walking toward them, its long arms swaying slightly by its sides. Masato and Katsuhiro want to run, but their legs refuse to move. The entity walks right up to the pillar, reaches out with one of its long, thin arms, and places its hand firmly on Masato's right shoulder. The moment the creature's hand makes contact, Masato feels an intense, freezing shock rip through his entire body. He tries to open his mouth to yell, but his jaw is locked completely shut. His muscles go completely rigid. He cannot breathe, he cannot move his arms, and he cannot take a single step backward. He is experiencing total instantaneous paralysis, trapped entirely in the grip of the entity. Katsuhiro, seeing his best friend freeze in place with this creature touching him, acts on pure instinct. He grabs the heavy fabric on the back of Masato's winter coat and yanks backward with every ounce of strength he has. The sudden violent pull breaks the entity's grip. The creature's hand slips off Masato's shoulder and the paralysis is instantly broken. Masato collapses backward into the dirt, gasping heavily for air. The boys scramble to their feet, turn around, and run blindly through the dark vineyard. They trip over the frozen ruts in the dirt, scrape their hands, and tear their coats on the metal trellis wires, not looking back once until they reach the pavement. They burst through the front door of Masato's apartment, completely out of breath. They throw their shoes off in the Genkan and run straight into the kitchen. They are hyperventilating, covered in mud, and crying uncontrollably. Masato's mother drops the knife she is holding on the cutting board and asks them what is wrong. They are babbling over each other, trying to explain the silver metal ship, the deep wrinkles, and the fangs. At first, Masato's mother is just annoyed. She assumes they were playing a prank in the mud and tells them to go wash their hands for dinner. But the boys are genuinely hysterical, shaking violently and pleading with her to just look outside. Realizing that something has truly upset them, she wipes her hands on her apron, walks over to the sliding glass door in the living room, and steps out onto the narrow balcony. From the second-floor balcony, she has a clear, unobstructed view of the vineyard. Katsuhiro's mother, who lives in the neighboring apartment, has also heard the screaming and has stepped out onto her own balcony. The two women lean over the metal railings and look out over the dark field. And right there, hovering silently, just a few dozen feet above the bare grapevines, is a massive, pulsing orange light. It is incredibly bright, rotating slowly in the freezing air, casting long shadows across the rows of concrete pillars. The two mothers stare at it in absolute disbelief. Then the glowing object suddenly accelerates. It shoots straight up into the night sky at an impossible speed, creating a sudden, violent gust of wind that vigorously rattles the laundry hanging on the balconies, and it completely vanishes into the thick clouds. The next morning, Monday, February 24th, the boys go to their elementary school and tell their teacher exactly what happened. The teacher assumes it is just an overactive imagination fueled by television. But later that morning, Masato's mother and Katsuhiro's mother both call the school and the local police station, officially reporting the massive, hovering light they witnessed from their balconies. the authorities realize they have multiple adult witnesses corroborating a strange event in the sky. The Yamanashi Prefectural Police dispatch a team of officers to the Hinode housing estate to investigate the vineyard. The officers expect to find that a group of local teenagers had set off some illegal flares, or maybe started a small bonfire in the dirt. They walk into the field carrying their notepads and measuring tapes, joking with each other about chasing ghosts. But when they reach the clearing where the boys claimed the craft had landed, the officers completely stop talking. They do not find burned flares or teenagers' footprints. They find massive, inexplicable physical damage. Two of the thick steel-reinforced concrete pillars that are used to hold up the heavy trellis wires are completely snapped in half. The thick concrete is sheared violently bent downward toward the earth, as if it had been crushed from above by an immense weight. And in the dirt directly beneath the broken pillars, the police find 3 large, perfectly circular impressions. The holes are arranged in an exact equilateral triangle. The dirt inside these 3 impressions is compacted incredibly hard, and the winter frost that covers the rest of the field has been completely melted away within the circles, leaving a strange gray ash-like residue coated over the dry earth. The police officers take dozens of photographs of the broken pillars and use their tape measures to record the exact depth and diameter of the 3 landing holes. They are completely baffled. They know that 2 7-year-old boys do not possess the physical strength required to snap reinforced concrete pillars in half. Based on the physical damage documented by the Yamanashi Prefectural Police, the subsequent environmental tests, and the multiple witness statements here is a reconstruction of what touched down in the vineyard on the evening of February 23rd. The unidentified craft descended from the sky carrying an enormous amount of physical mass. As it lowered blindly into the dark vineyard, it did not land in an empty clearing. It came down directly on top of the established agricultural infrastructure. The heavy metal hull of the ship pressed down onto the concrete trellis system, and the sheer weight of the craft effortlessly crushed the 2 steel-reinforced pillars, snapping them entirely in half. The 3 spherical landing gears slammed into the frozen dirt with tons of force compacting the soil into hard, circular indentations and generating enough immediate heat to instantly melt the frost and scorch the top layer of dirt into ash. The entity then lowered its metal ramp, stepped out into the freezing air, and began a perimeter check of its landing zone. It noticed the 2 young boys hiding nearby. It walked over and physically engaged one of them, making direct flesh-to-clothing contact with Masato's shoulder. The physical contact caused an immediate, severe physiological reaction, a localized nervous system overload that resulted in total body paralysis. When the second boy broke the physical connection and the children fled, the entity returned to its ship. The craft then powered up its propulsion system, generating an intense wave of heat and energy that created the blinding orange glow. It then violently lifted off the ground, leaving behind the crushed concrete and the deep scorched tread marks in the earth. Later that same afternoon, a science teacher from the local high school arrives at the vineyard. He had heard the rumors from the police officers and has brought a Geiger counter with him to test the soil. He turns the heavy yellow machine on. The normal background radiation in Kofu City is extremely low, and the machine clicks very slowly as he walks through the rows of grapevines. But when the teacher steps into the clearing and lowers the wand directly over the first of the 3 circular impressions in the dirt, the machine instantly begins clicking rapidly. The red needle on the dial jumps aggressively to the right. The soil inside the landing mark is emitting inexplicably high levels of radiation. The teacher is stunned. He moves the wand over to the second hole, and then to the third. He gets the exact same result. The high, unnatural radiation is contained perfectly within the 3 specific spots where the craft's landing gear had touched the earth. The Yamanashi Prefectural Police officially documented the broken concrete, the deep indentations, and the anomalous radiation readings, but they were never able to provide a conventional earthly explanation for what happened in the vineyard. That night, the event remains one of the most physically documented close encounters on record. But while these 2 young boys experienced an impossible physical visitation in a quiet Japanese city, leaving behind traces of radiation and broken concrete. A completely different kind of unbelievable story was unfolding in the United States. This next event did not involve a silver craft falling from the sky, but rather a massive multi-million-dollar kidnapping plot where a jury would eventually decide that the victim had actually written the entire script himself. On a humid Friday evening, August 8th, 1975, a 21-year-old man named Samuel Bronfman II was sitting at a long, polished dining room table in Purchase, New York. And this was not just a normal, well-off suburban household. Samuel, who went by the name Sam, was the direct heir to the massive Seagram liquor empire. His father, Edgar Bronfman, was a billionaire industrialist, and their family estate perfectly reflected that status. The property was hidden far back from the main road, sitting behind tall iron security gates and thick stone walls. Inside those gates, the estate featured sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns, a private tennis court, large heated swimming pools, and a massive multi-story stone mansion filled with extremely expensive art, imported rugs, and heavy antique furniture. Sam had just recently graduated from Williams College in Massachusetts and was spending his summer working as a junior staffer at Sports Illustrated magazine in Manhattan. He had his own private apartment in a separate complex a few miles away in the town of Purchase, but he frequently drove back to the main estate to eat dinners cooked by the family's private staff. On this particular Friday night, Sam was having dinner with his mother. His father, Edgar, was out of the country, traveling on a corporate business trip in Europe. The dinner conversation was completely mundane. They sat in the large, quiet dining room, listening to the low, constant hum of the central air conditioning system, and talked about the heavy summer heat, Sam's commute into the city, and his plans for the upcoming weekend. Around 11:30 at night, Sam pushed his heavy wooden chair back from the table. He told his mother that he was tired from the work week and wanted to get back to his own apartment to get some sleep. He walked out the heavy oak front doors of the mansion, walked down the wide stone steps, and stepped out onto the circular gravel driveway. The night air was thick and loud with the sound of cicadas. He got into his dark green BMW sedan, started the engine, and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway. He passed through the automated iron security gates and pulled out onto the dark, empty county road, heading toward his apartment complex. The next morning, Saturday, August 9th, one of the Bronfman family's household staff members was driving through the town of Purchase to run some basic errands. As they drove past the specific apartment complex where Sam lived, they glanced over and noticed Sam's green BMW was parked in the driveway. But the car was not pulled all the way into its designated parking spot. It was parked at a strange, awkward angle with the rear tires resting on the grass. And as the staff member looked closer, they saw that the driver's side door was standing wide open. The staff member pulled their car over and walked up to the BMW. The keys were still sitting right there in the ignition. A pile of Sam's gym clothes was resting casually on the passenger seat. But the car was completely empty, and Sam was nowhere to be seen. The staff member walked up to the front door of Sam's apartment and knocked heavily on the wood. There was no answer. The windows were completely dark, and the curtains were pulled shut. The staff member immediately drove back to the main Seagram estate and called the local police to report the abandoned vehicle. By that afternoon, local police cruisers were parked around the green BMW. And officers were walking through the grass, looking for footprints or signs of a physical struggle. But they found absolutely nothing. However, before the police could even finish processing the car in the driveway, a letter arrived back at the main Bronfman estate. It was delivered directly to the house in a plain envelope, and it was addressed specifically to Edgar Bronfman. Edgar was immediately contacted by his staff and was flown back from his European business trip on a private corporate jet. When he walked into his mansion and opened the envelope, he found a typed message on standard white paper. The note claimed that a highly organized group of men had abducted Sam from his driveway. It stated that if Edgar ever wanted to see his 21-year-old son alive again, he needed to quickly gather $4.5 million in unmarked, non-sequential bills. The note included very strict instructions, telling Edgar to wait by the heavy rotary phone in the main study of the mansion for a phone call that would give him the exact drop-off location, and warned him that involving law enforcement would result in Sam's immediate death. Edgar completely ignored the warning and immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within hours, dozens of federal agents in dark suits descended on the Purchase estate. They parked their unmarked sedans out of sight inside the large multi-car garages. They carried heavy reel-to-reel audio recording equipment into the mansion and hardwired the machines directly into the phone lines located in the main study. Agents set up a massive command center right in the living room, clearing off the expensive glass coffee tables to lay out detailed topographic maps of the New York tri-state area. They briefed Edgar on exactly what he needed to say when the phone rang. They told him to keep the kidnappers talking for as long as humanly possible so they could attempt to trace the origin of the call. And then the family and the agents just sat in the quiet, heavily guarded house and waited. 2 agonizing days later, the rotary phone in the study finally rang. Edgar picked up the receiver while the FBI technicians pressed their heavy headphones to their ears, watching the tape reels begin to spin. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man speaking with a thick, muffled, working-class accent. The caller referred to himself only as Blood. He demanded that Edgar personally pack the $4.5 million and wait for further instructions. Over the next several days, a series of short, frantic phone calls took place between the estate and the kidnappers. During one of these specific calls, the kidnappers put Sam on the line. Sam's voice was shaking, cracking, and pitched unusually high. He begged his father to just pay the ransom money. He said the men holding him in a dark room were heavily armed and were going to kill him if the cash was not delivered exactly as instructed. The FBI technicians recorded every single word of the conversation, analyzing the background noise for traffic sounds or train whistles, but the calls were always cut short and disconnected before a solid trace could be fully established on the line. Edgar Bronfman utilized his massive corporate banking connections to quickly liquidate $4.5 million in cash. Because the kidnappers demanded small, non-sequential bills, the physical money weighed over 150 pounds. The stacks of cash were packed tightly into 2 heavy canvas duffel bags, following a new, highly specific set of instructions from the final phone call. Edgar placed the heavy bags into the trunk of his car and drove completely alone into the city. He was directed to drive down the busy expressways until he reached a dense residential neighborhood in the borough of Queens near the John F. Kennedy International Airport. He was told to park his car on a specific street under an elevated train track, leave the keys right in the ignition, and walk away down the sidewalk without looking back. Edgar followed the instructions perfectly. He parked, left the keys, and walked away into the dark. But unbeknownst to the kidnappers, the FBI had completely saturated the entire drop zone. Dozens of federal agents were sitting in unmarked cars with the headlights off, posing as normal pedestrians walking dogs on the sidewalks, and watching through binoculars from the dark windows of nearby apartment buildings. The agents waited in total silence. A short time later, they watched as 2 men walked down the street, approached Edgar's parked car, opened the trunk, and grabbed the heavy canvas bags. The men loaded the massive bags of cash into their own vehicle and quickly drove away. The FBI agents did not move in to arrest the men right away. Their primary objective was to recover Sam Bronfman alive, and they did not know where he was being held. So they initiated a massive coordinated mobile tail. A dozen unmarked federal cars quietly followed the suspect's vehicle as it drove away from the airport area, merging onto the busy nighttime highways, and eventually crossing over into the borough of Brooklyn. The suspects pulled up in front of a 6-story brick apartment building on a crowded, noisy street in the Flatbush neighborhood. The agents watched from a distance as the 2 men carried the canvas bags out of their car, walked through the glass double doors of the building, and headed upstairs. The FBI tactical teams immediately set up a hard perimeter, completely locking down the entire city block. They spent several hours monitoring the building's exterior, tapping the building's super, and verifying exactly which apartment unit the men had entered on the fourth floor. Late that night, a heavily armed tactical team of FBI agents lined up quietly outside the wooden door of the fourth floor apartment. The lead agent raised a heavy steel battering ram, pulled it back, and swung it forward with massive force. The wood splintered instantly, the door flew open, and the agents flooded into the narrow hallway, shouting commands with their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the dark rooms. Inside the small living room, they found the two men from the drop site sitting on a worn fabric couch with the canvas bags of money unzipped and open on the floor. The agents immediately tackled both men to the ground, pressing their faces into the carpet and placed them in heavy steel handcuffs. Another group of agents cleared the rest of the apartment, kicking open the doors to the bathroom and the kitchen. Finally, they kicked open the door to the single bedroom. Inside the bedroom, the agents found Sam Bronfman. He was sitting on the floor in the corner of the room. His hands were bound tightly behind his back with heavy white rope, and his eyes were covered by a thick cloth blindfold. The agents rushed over, pulled the blindfold off his face, and quickly cut the ropes away from his wrists. Sam was physically unharmed, but he appeared completely shaken, pale, and exhausted. The FBI safely escorted him out of the building, placed him in a secure vehicle, and transported him directly back to the safety of his family's estate in Westchester County. The two men arrested in the living room were formally identified as Mel Patrick Lynch, an active New York City firefighter, and Dominic Byrne, a local limousine driver. Neither man had an extensive criminal record. The FBI held a massive, highly publicized press conference the very next morning, proudly announcing to the country that the massive $4.5 million ransom had been fully recovered without a single missing bill, and the violent kidnappers were safely behind bars. It was hailed as a flawless textbook law enforcement operation. The trial of Mel Patrick Lynch and Dominic Byrne began in 1976 at the federal courthouse in Manhattan. The prosecution laid out a very straightforward, seemingly unbeatable case. They had the typed ransom notes, they had the reel-to-reel audio recordings of the ransom demands, and Sam's pleas for his life. They had the undeniable physical evidence of the $4.5 million in cash found directly in the defendant's living room, and they had the sworn testimony of multiple FBI agents who had found Sam bound and blindfolded in the bedroom. The jury sat quietly in the heavy wooden benches, taking notes and listening to what seemed like an absolutely airtight federal kidnapping case. But when the defense attorneys stood up to present their side to the jury, they completely abandoned the standard legal playbook. They did not try to claim that Lynch and Byrne were innocent of taking the money, nor did they claim it was a case of mistaken identity. Instead, they presented a completely different narrative that left the judge, the prosecution, and the entire courtroom in stunned silence. The defense claimed that there was actually no kidnapping at all. They argued that Sam Bronfman himself had orchestrated the entire plot, and that Lynch and Byrne were simply pawns who were acting out a highly detailed script that Sam had personally written and directed. The defense attorneys began pointing to a series of bizarre inconsistencies in the prosecution's own physical evidence. First, they brought up the typed ransom note. Linguistic experts took the stand and testified that the specific phrasing, the unique vocabulary, and the sentence structures used in the extortion letter perfectly matched Sam's own writing style from his personal letters and college essays. Second, they pointed out the physical condition of the victim. Sam was completely unharmed after spending over a week in captivity. They presented evidence showing that the white ropes used to bind his hands in the bedroom were actually tied incredibly loosely, using simple slip knots, almost exactly as if he had tied them himself, just moments before the door was breached. But the most damaging piece of evidence came from the background investigation into the personal relationship between Sam and his supposed captors. The defense produced witnesses who testified under oath that they had seen Sam Bronfman and Mel Patrick Lynch drinking and socializing together at various bars in New York City, several months before the alleged kidnapping ever took place. They argued that Sam, feeling overshadowed by his billionaire father and wanting to secure a massive financial payout of his own without waiting for his inheritance, had approached Lynch and Byrne with a criminal proposition. The defense claimed Sam promised the two working-class men a large cut of the $4.5 million if they simply made the muffled phone calls, picked up the canvas bags of cash, and provided him with a quiet apartment, hideout in. The defense then replayed the audio recordings of Sam pleading for his life on the phone. They argued to the jury that the shaking voice and the high-pitched tone was simply bad acting, completely staged to force his wealthy father to panic and pay up quickly. Furthermore, Lynch took the stand and dropped a bombshell, claiming that he and Sam actually had a secret romantic relationship, and that the entire kidnapping was a cover story they had concocted together to extract money from the Seagram Empire so they could live comfortably. Sam violently denied these accusations on the stand, weeping and maintaining that he was held at gunpoint the entire time. But the damage to the prosecution's narrative was already done. Based on the court transcripts, the physical evidence presented at trial, and the defense's highly detailed timeline here, is a reconstruction of what the jury believed actually happened to Sam Bronfman on the night of August 8th, 1975. Sam left his father's massive estate and drove his green BMW back toward his own apartment complex in Purchase. But he did not park his car properly in his designated spot because he was carefully executing the first step of his own plan. He parked at a strange angle, left the driver's side door standing wide open, and left the keys right in the ignition to make it look to anyone passing by like a sudden, violent struggle had taken place in the driveway. He then willingly walked down the dark street and got into a waiting vehicle driven by his associate, Mel Patrick Lynch. They drove calmly out of Westchester County and went directly to Lynch's apartment in Brooklyn. For the next several days, Sam was not a terrified hostage. He was the director of the operation. He sat at the small kitchen table with Lynch carefully typing out the ransom note on a portable typewriter, making sure to include the specific non-sequential bill demands that he knew his father's corporate banking connections could easily accommodate. When it was time to make the ransom phone calls, Sam stood right next to Lynch in the apartment. He coached Lynch on exactly what to say to Edgar Bronfman to maximize the urgency. When Sam got on the phone to plead for his life, he was holding the receiver himself, intentionally faking the tremble in his voice, completely aware that the FBI technicians were recording every single word on their spinning tapes. The entire setup inside the Brooklyn apartment was incredibly relaxed. They ordered local takeout food, they watched television, and they simply waited for the ransom drop to take place. When Lynch and Byrne returned to the apartment carrying the heavy canvas bags filled with $4.5 million, they unzipped them on the living room floor and stared at the massive pile of cash. They had successfully pulled off the ultimate extortion against one of the richest men in the country. But then they heard the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the FBI tactical team rushing up the wooden stairs of the apartment building. Sam knew he could not be found sitting casually on the couch, surrounded by his father's money. He immediately ran into the small bedroom. He grabbed a piece of heavy white rope, hastily wrapped it around his own wrists using loose slip knots, and slipped a soft cloth blindfold over his eyes. He sat down heavily on the floor in the corner of the room just seconds before the heavy steel battering ram shattered the front door. When the federal agents burst into the bedroom with their flashlights and weapons, Sam played the role of the terrified rescued victim perfectly, while his two accomplices were tackled to the floor and dragged away in handcuffs. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, they reviewed all of the physical evidence, the linguistic analysis of the notes, and the completely conflicting narratives. After several days of intense, heated discussion in the jury room, they returned to the courtroom and delivered a massive, unprecedented verdict. The jury fully acquitted Mel Patrick Lynch and Dominic Byrne of all kidnapping charges. They completely rejected the prosecution's claim that Sam Bronfman had ever been abducted. However, because Lynch and Byrne did actually physically retrieve the $4.5 million from the drop site, the jury convicted them of the much lesser crime of grand larceny. The two men served only a very small fraction of the massive federal prison sentences they would have received for a kidnapping conviction. Sam Bronfman never faced any criminal charges for the incident, and he maintained his original story that he was the victim of a violent abduction for the rest of his life. He returned to his life of immense wealth and privilege, leaving the truth of what really happened inside that Brooklyn apartment permanently buried under a mountain of contradictory testimonies and a stunning legal verdict. But while this young heir was orchestrating a massive, multi-million-dollar illusion inside a cramped city apartment, a very real and entirely inescapable hostage crisis was unfolding thousands of miles away. High above the craps clouds, this next event did not involve a staged ransom drop or a loosely tied blindfold, but rather a hijacked passenger plane, a brutal military dictator, and the most audacious covert rescue mission in modern history. On the afternoon of June 27, 1976, Captain Michel Bacos sat in his seat in the cockpit of Air France Flight 139. He was going through his standard pre-flight checklist on the tarmac at the busy airport in Athens, Greece. The weather outside was hot and completely clear, and the air conditioning inside the plane hummed loudly. Back in the main cabin, 246 passengers were finding their seats and stowing their luggage. As the passengers settled in, many were returning from long family vacations in Israel. Children were leaning over the armrests, trading toys and playing games in the narrow aisles. A group of teenagers traveling together were laughing loudly near the back. Once the heavy cabin doors were locked, Captain Bacos steered the massive aircraft toward the runway. The engines roared to life, pushing the passengers back into their seats as the plane lifted off the ground. They climbed steadily over the Mediterranean Sea, and the seatbelt signs blinked off with a familiar chime. The cabin crew immediately began handing out small cups of water. About 10 minutes into the flight, a flight attendant was pouring a drink near the front row of the economy section. She was holding a plastic cup when a young man in a dark jacket suddenly stood up from his window seat. He pushed past the person sitting next to him and stepped directly into the aisle. He did not say a word to the flight attendant. He just reached into his jacket. He pulled out a heavy metal pistol and a round fragmentation grenade. At the exact same moment, another man and a woman stood up in the first-class section, holding identical weapons. They shouted for everyone to stay in their seats and keep their hands visible. The passengers completely froze. The flight attendant dropped the cup she was holding, spilling liquid over the carpet. The man with the grenade grabbed the flight attendant by her uniform and shoved her toward the front of the plane. He pointed his pistol at the heavy cockpit door and ordered her to unlock it. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bacos heard a loud commotion coming from the cabin. But before he could even reach for the internal radio, the heavy cockpit door swung violently open. A man stepped inside and immediately pressed the cold barrel of a pistol directly against the side of the captain's neck. He held the grenade in his other hand with his finger hooked through the metal pin. The man spoke in broken English, ordering Captain Bacos to instantly change the plane's heading. He told him to turn the aircraft south, completely away from the coast of Europe. And so Captain Bacos looked at the grenade and then slowly turned the aircraft's yoke. The plane banked sharply, causing the passengers in the back to grip their armrests. The hijackers walked up and down the aisles collecting passports from every single person on board. They tossed the small booklets into a large plastic bag. The cabin was completely silent except for the engines. They flew for hours over the open water. The fuel gauges in the cockpit were dropping rapidly, and Captain Bacos warned the men holding him hostage that the engines would soon stop running. The hijackers ordered him to land in Benghazi, Libya. The plane touched down heavily on the desert runway, and they sat on the baking tarmac for 7 hours while a fuel truck pumped gas. When the plane was forced to sit on the tarmac in Benghazi, the situation inside the cabin became completely miserable. The hijackers refused to let the pilots run the auxiliary power, meaning the air conditioning was shut off. The metal fuselage baked under the intense Libyan sun, turning the sealed passenger cabin into a massive oven. Passengers sweated through their clothes. Once the tanks were full, the hijackers ordered the captain back into the sky. They flew deeper into the African continent, flying straight through the middle of the night. The passengers were exhausted, hungry, and sitting in the dark. Finally, just before sunrise on June 28th, the plane began to descend. They were approaching Entebbe Airport in the country of Uganda. The plane landed and taxied toward a dilapidated building that sat completely isolated on the edge of the airport property. It was the old terminal, a structure that had not been used in years. The engine shut down and the heavy cabin doors were pushed open. The thick, humid African heat immediately flooded into the aircraft, bringing with it the smell of rotting vegetation. The hijackers ordered all 246 passengers to stand up and walk down the metal stairs onto the tarmac. When the passengers stepped outside, they were met by dozens of Ugandan soldiers. The soldiers were wearing green military fatigues and holding heavy automatic rifles. But they were not there to help the passengers. They were actively guarding the hijackers. The passengers were marched through a set of dirty glass doors into the main room of the old terminal. The building was in a state of total decay. The paint was peeling off the walls in large strips, and several of the windows were completely shattered. There was no furniture, no chairs, and no working plumbing. The passengers were told to sit directly on the dusty concrete floor. Later that afternoon, a massive black limousine pulled up to the glass doors of the terminal. A very tall, heavily built man stepped out of the vehicle surrounded by an armed detail. It was Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda. He walked into the terminal wearing a crisp military uniform covered in shiny metals. He smiled broadly at the hostages sitting on the floor and began to speak. He claimed that the Ugandan army was doing everything in its power to keep the passengers comfortable. But the moment his personal photographers stopped snapping pictures, he turned his back on the hostages and walked directly over to the hijackers. He shook their hands enthusiastically and congratulated them on the operation. The dictator had provided this terminal as a safe haven. The next day, the hijackers stood at the front of the room, holding the plastic bag full of passports. They pulled out a megaphone and began reading names aloud. Whenever a name was called, that person was ordered to stand up and walk through a set of wooden double doors into a much smaller, cramped room down the hallway. The hijackers were specifically targeting Israeli passports. But they did not stop there. They also began calling the names of anyone they believed to be Jewish, regardless of which country their passport came from. The people whose names were called were shoved into the small room, packed tightly together in the stifling heat. The remaining passengers were left in the main hall. A few hours later, the hijackers made an announcement. They told the non-Jewish passengers that their governments had complied with certain demands and that they were going to be released. Ugandan soldiers began herding this group out toward waiting buses. The hijackers then walked over to Captain Michel Bakos. They told him that because he was French and not Jewish, he and his flight crew were free to leave the terminal and go home. Captain Bakos looked at the hijackers, and then he looked down the hallway at the small room where the remaining hostages were being held. He told the men with the guns that he was the captain of the aircraft, and he was completely responsible for every single person who had boarded his plane in Athens. He firmly refused to leave. He told them he would stay until everyone was freed. His entire flight crew stood right behind him and agreed. They watched the buses drive away, leaving them behind with the roughly 100 remaining hostages. The days began to drag on, and you have to understand the heat inside the old terminal was completely suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the overflowing broken toilets down the hall. A few of the older passengers began to fall ill from the lack of clean water and the intense psychological stress. Captain Bakos would periodically walk over to the doorway of this small room, trying to check on their condition. The hijackers would point their rifles at his chest and order him to step back, but he continued to advocate for medical supplies and better daily rations. The hijackers issued a final deadline. They demanded that 53 militants held in prisons across the globe be released by the afternoon of July 4th. If the demands were not met, they would begin executing the hostages inside the terminal. The Ugandan military reinforced the perimeter, stationing heavily armed guards at every exit and placing a massive radar truck outside. The hostages sat on the floor, sharing small scraps of meat and warm water provided by the soldiers. They tried to sleep on the hard concrete, using their shoes as pillows. By the night of July 3rd, the terminal was completely quiet. The deadline was only a few hours away. The hostages knew their governments would never release the militants. They just lay in the dark waiting. Some of the younger children were crying softly in the corners of the room. Captain Bakos walked slowly among the passengers, whispering quiet words of encouragement to the families. He tried to keep their spirits up, but he could see the absolute exhaustion on their faces. The Ugandan soldiers outside were smoking cigarettes and leaning against their rifles in the dark. Based on declassified military archives, flight logs, and testimony from the passengers, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of July 3rd, 1976. The hijackers were taking turns pacing back and forth across the dirty floor. They had complete control of the terminal and a heavily armed foreign military guarding the perimeter. They felt entirely secure. The sky outside the shattered windows was pitch black. There were no streetlights on this side of the airport, and a thick layer of clouds blocked out the moon. The only illumination came from a single flickering fluorescent bulb hanging from the ceiling in the hallway. The hijackers knew the deadline was approaching, and they were fully prepared to begin carrying out the executions. At exactly 11 at night, a low rhythmic vibration began to travel through the concrete floorboards. It was a deep, mechanical hum that seemed to be coming from the sky directly above the terminal. The hijackers stopped pacing and looked up at the ceiling. The Ugandan guards outside threw their cigarettes on the ground and looked up into the darkness. The humming grew much louder. The guards were incredibly confused. There were no runway lights turned on, and the air traffic control tower had not radioed about any incoming flight. Suddenly, the massive wheels of a heavy transport plane slammed down hard onto the dark tarmac, just a few hundred yards from the old terminal. The pilot threw the engines into reverse, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. The hijackers watched in disbelief as the heavy hydraulic cargo door at the back of the aircraft dropped wide open while the plane was still moving. A sleek black Mercedes sedan rolled straight down the ramp and hit the tarmac, accompanied by two mud-covered Land Rovers. The three vehicles accelerated immediately, driving in a tight formation directly toward the main glass doors. The Ugandan soldiers standing outside instantly lowered their rifles. The black Mercedes was the exact make, model, and color of the personal vehicle driven by Idi Amin. The guards assumed their dictator was making a surprise midnight visit to check on the hostages before the deadline. They stood up straight and brought their hands to their foreheads to salute the approaching motorcade. But as the black Mercedes skidded to a halt in front of the glass doors, the men inside did not wait for an escort. The doors flew open, and a team of men dressed in unmarked combat gear poured out onto the concrete. They were holding suppressed submachine guns. They did not hesitate for a single second. They raised their weapons and eliminated the guards standing at the entrance. The planes that landed in the dark did not belong to Uganda. They belonged to the Israeli Defense Forces. For days, the Israeli military had been secretly planning an operation that was considered completely impossible. They had loaded elite commandos into 4 heavy transport planes and flown them 2,500 miles through the night, flying a mere 30 feet above the Red Sea. As soon as the commandos neutralized the guards at the door, they kicked the shattered glass aside and stormed straight into the main hallway. The firefight was deafening in the enclosed space. The commandos shouted in Hebrew through a bullhorn, ordering all the passengers to hit the floor. The hostages scrambled over each other, pressing their faces against the dirty concrete. The hijackers tried to raise their weapons, but they were completely overwhelmed by the speed and precision of the incoming assault team. Within exactly 90 minutes, the entire operation was over. The commandos cleared the building, eliminated the hostage-takers, and destroyed several Ugandan fighter jets parked on the tarmac to prevent anyone from pursuing them into the night sky. They rushed the hostages out into the humid air, directing them across the dark runway and up the loading ramps into the waiting military transport planes. The heavy cargo doors sealed shut, and the planes took off, leaving the burning runway behind them. Out of the 106 hostages held in that room, 102 survived the impossible rescue and were flown home. Captain Michel Bacos was later given the highest civilian honor in France for his absolute refusal to abandon the passengers in his care. But the success of the mission came at a very heavy cost. During the initial breach of the terminal, the commander of the elite assault team was struck by a bullet fired from the control tower. He was the only commando to lose his life that night. His name was Yonatan Netanyahu, the older brother of the man who would eventually become the Prime Minister of Israel. He was laid to rest with full military honors, remembered as the architect of one of the most daring and logistically impossible hostage rescues in the history of modern warfare, saving over 100 innocent people from the suffocating heat of an abandoned terminal. But while this massive military force crossed an entire continent in the dead of night to execute a cinematic rescue against all odds, another kind of tragedy was taking shape in the Italian mountains. This next event did not involve a calculated assault or a hostage standoff, but rather a completely unexpected mechanical snap high above